Hey guys, we're going to continue looking at unicorns in the Bible. This is a video done recently by TurritinFan, and so we just want to have a examination on the second section that he has on his website. So he's divided this up into several sections. So in our last video, in part one, we were looking at issues like the Oxford English Dictionary, and also the concept that TurritinFan seem to think that the King James translators only thought unicorn. They primarily thought that it was like a white horse with a narwhal type horn in the middle of its head, and that's the only definition that they really had, which seems very strange because in this second section they clearly have a footnote saying all rhinoceros. But yeah, if you go back through that video, you can see where I've gone through the claims of Shakespeare, going through a lot of claims that TurritinFan says that all of these claims are talking about the mythical creature. And so I go through that and how not every time they're talking about the nose of a unicorn is that a mythical creature, because the nose of the rhinoceros was also seen as something that had medicinal powers, and even to this day poachers are still looking for these rhinoceroses in parts of India and also parts of Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. So that's just our closest neighbor here in Australia. And they're looking for these rhinos to get their horns for medicinal purposes, and people will pay top dollar for this. So, and also going through the Oxford English Dictionary, it just seems that, or I basically proved that TurritinFan is only seeing what he wants to see. He's not reading the context of these dictionaries. He's not going through and looking at all the issues involved. And so I would recommend that you go back through part one. It does go for quite a long period of time. But if you've gone through TurritinFan's video and you're like, wow, he's made some very good points, I would suggest that you go back and look through that. Because many times he's saying, oh, just like Shakespeare said, and it's like you can't really be clear what Shakespeare's really talking about. He just mentions unicorn, that's it. Where TurritinFan seems to bring that on board and like, oh, that's proof of a mythical creature. And so anyway, we're moving into part two. What about rhinoceroses as a meaning for unicorn in the King James? Now, I was trying to find the exact place where this overlapped, and I sort of stopped at a place where it seems that TurritinFan sort of sums this up, and it's quite interesting to listen just to what he says here. So I'm just going to play this a little bit. Now, as always with StreamYard, unfortunately, it has a little bit of a glitch sometimes when you're trying to get sound from a video. So I'm going to make this large and I'm going to play it on my phone. And it says,
and while, like I said, while
okay, beautiful. So it's all working properly. So I'll shut that down. When you get YouTube Premium, it's playing Crocodile Dundee in shorts for some reason. Okay, so it looks like TurritinFan is doing a video at exactly the same time, which is kind of weird. So anyway, I'll look at that later. So let's just continue on with this. So yeah, let's let TurritinFan just start talking and we'll go through this video.
I find a lot of the later explanations persuasive, such as those that say it refers to a wild ox. That's not what the King James translators meant when they wrote it, and the King James would be improved by just striking out the word unicorn.
So notice he's saying the King James would be improved by striking out the word unicorn. Now listen to this.
And replacing it with something like wild bull or wild.
Replace it with something like wild bull or wild ox. So he's not definitive here. Just change the Bible, just strike it out and just write in something Just whatever sort of comes to your imagination of what critical text people have said over the years, or what other modern translations have said, with a wild ox or a wild bull, an auroch or something. Just cross out what the King James has and put not definitively one of these, but just whatever you want there, sort of out of this pile of
wild ox,
issues.
or even aurochs, or
Names.
even just transliterating and putting the Hebrew word reem.
Transliterate it and just have reem, because no one can understand what this animal is. So just have reem there. Don't try and bring it across. And so that way people will look it up in a modern dictionary and get wild ox anyway, sort of thing, because they match these dictionaries to the modern versions that are coming out.
And then putting a note saying what we think the reem is, rather than putting in unicorn where it's not correct. So what about rhinoceros?
Okay, so this is entering into the second part. So it just does seem quite strange that he sort of goes out of his way to make out that the King James translators never really consider rhinoceros as being a valid explanation for what a unicorn is. And I proved in my last video that these are synonymous. It's just so clear that I can't understand. If someone's not seeing this, they're simply not doing proper research into. They're not reading the Oxford English Dictionary properly. And so for the King James translators, a unicorn and rhinoceros were synonymous. But TurritinFan's claiming that the only definition for unicorn was the horse with the with the horn, the mythical unicorn. And so that's what they meant. And so it was sort of like that's all that generation really had. And so he went through, certain dictionaries and things like that. But I've gone through a lot of the usage, and so I'll just quickly show you. You can see how many tabs I've got open. It's quite ridiculous. And that's only one page. I've got another one here with a whole bunch of tabs. We can see here in 1398, it has rhinoceron, Latin rhinoceron. The unicorn is a wild beast by kind and may be tamed by no wise. It can't be tamed. And it has, there be many kinds of unicorn, for some being rhinoceron and some monoceron and some eliceron. And yes, these are like 1398, so nearly 1400. These are Middle English definitions. And so Daniel Webster's, and so the thing is, as I pointed out in my last video, TurritinFan seems to go, Pliny the Elder was talking about a mythical creature. But when you read it, it's like, well, why is that a mythical creature? What makes that the horse with the horn? Why can't you just see that that's either a rhinoceros or maybe an extinct animal very similar to a rhinoceros? I just can't see why not. Aristotle, I have found that the wild asses as large as horses are to be found in India. It has a horn on the brow, about 1.5 cubits in length. And so he was just making this up, sort of thing. This is just talking about the mythical creature. You know what I'm saying? And so it depends how you define things, because the Indian ass is, and I actually found it yesterday. Is it in this pile of links? I've just got this graveyard of links here of information that I've really got to put into my website. I'm pretty sure it was this one here. So the Indian ass. And so we found out that this was called this is basically the Karkadan, which is a rhinoceros. People say the Karkadan is most probably in the Indian rhinoceros. So this was formerly called an Indian ass. So I'm just not sure why TurritinFan was saying that. And you can see my frustration in the last video. It's like, well, just do a little bit more homework on this before it's just defined that the King James translators didn't know anything about rhinoceroses and didn't know anything about any other, rhinoceros type beast. I mean, you're talking about 60 people here, not just one person, sort of in the dark, the lights are off, sort of thing. these guys knew their stuff, and they had the marginal note rhinoceros. It just really frustrates me when I see this kind of fallacy. Anyway, let's just continue through part 2.
As a meaning for unicorn in the King James Version. That was an allegation. Well, they said unicorn, but don't be silly. They didn't really mean unicorn. They meant rhinoceros.
Well, when you understand that rhinoceros and unicorn, one of the definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary is a rhinoceros for a unicorn. It's definition number 7, and it says it's obsolete. When it goes through the biblical understanding, so I might actually just get that up. Just in case you can't be bothered looking at video number 1. I don't want to. Okay, so when we go through, it goes through the here, B, used in Middle English versions of the Old Testament to render the vulgate unicornus or rhinoceros. Monokoros is the translation of the Hebrew Reem. And so it says it's translated wild ox in the Revised Bible. And when you go through it, it's talking about the unicorn. And so one of the first things it says here is that the unicorn has at various times been identified or confused with the rhinoceros. Then we go through number 7 here. It has a one-horned rhinoceros, obsolete. And it gives us some insight into that. And so I just, for the life of me, I just don't understand why. Like, so in the debate, I've said, okay, read the Oxford English Dictionary and you understand that a unicorn is synonymous with a rhinoceros. And here it clearly says that sometimes the unicorn has at various times been identified or confused with a rhinoceros. So many times these are synonymous terms. And so for TurritinFan to just say that that's not true, it's just sort of like, well, what more can I say, or what can I say with that? Just get with the program.
At Isaiah 34:7, the King James Version has a marginal note that says, or rhinoceros. And you can see it on the screen here. It says, or rhinoceros. And it's at verse 34:7. And here's the unicorns in the main text. And or rhinoceros is the marginal reading. Now, the question is, what do these marginal readings mean? And the answer to that question is that the marginal readings mean an alternative view. And this is worth exploring.
So many times the word alternative can be a loaded term. Having an alternative view, yes, of something synonymous. So we've seen even in the debate, it was the word troop and numbers, and I think it was Gad, and I can't remember the other word, but it was in somewhere else in Isaiah. I think it was 65, maybe 11 or something like that. But we saw that these were literally those words. Now, I'm pretty sure it had the same few lines there, but I could be wrong. But what we see in I went through all of Timothy Berg's article, or I think he had 5 different types of marginal notes or something like that. And so I went through his article. I think I did about 5 videos on that, and I sort of got a bit tired because he just constantly misrepresented the translators and made out that these marginal notes were just places of doubt. Okay. So these marginal notes aren't like, say, when you read the New King James and you got the NA United Bible Society text says this. Those to me are places of doubt because I'm a TR person. I'm a Masoretic text guy. If I see it says the Septuagint says this, I'm not really interested in that. Now, I might be interested in it in doing a Bible study, but I'm not interested in changing the Bible to suit that, or a Targum or something else. And even TurritinFan was saying, if there's any conjectural emendation, he's not into it. So he rejects the NA 28 places where there's conjecture. And so to me, something like the New King James, many times in the Old Testament, it is changed to suit the Vulgate, or it's changed to suit the Septuagint, where the King James is just a pure translation from the Masoretic text. Now, they would have used other texts they used everything. So to sort of say, oh, well, they looked at the Septuagint as well, you sort of think it's like, well, yeah, they understood things, they looked at everything, but they understood that these texts, like say the Septuagint, was corrupted, and the Latin was corrupted as well, or else they would have followed them. So when you have marginal notes, oftentimes you've got to put yourself in the position of these translators. So they've gone through all the English material, and in these English Bibles, say in the bishops, in the Geneva, in the Tyndale, they might have certain various readings. And so sometimes having a marginal note just helps you clear things up. It might have, instead of to receive something, you give something. It's the same Greek word, but in the context. And English was morphing and changing through that period of time too. From between Tyndale and the King James, English became quite a prominent language. And it's probably only, 30, 40, 50 years before the King James that a lot of grammars and dictionaries and things came out for the English language, whereas before that it wasn't really that well settled. And so when you're looking at the marginal notes, sometimes it's to do with English language. It's saying, okay, we understand. They're basically saying to the English reader, they've got their Bible, but they've also got their older Bibles. So whether it's a Douay Rheims or whether it's a Geneva or whatever Bible they've got, there might be a marginal note at a place that gives them comfort that the translators know about the issue. That, it's like, oh, hang on, the Bishop's Bible says this and the King James says this. And it's like, oh, hang on, they've got a marginal note and it says, they've looked at that issue. That's why there's a name missing here. Or that's why the city is translated and it's not just kept as a Hebrew word or something like that. And so, this type of thing is quite common in the King James to do that. And when it's talking about, the Hebrew says this, sometimes it might have a wooden translate like Hebrew, so like almost like a transliteration. Almost like what an interlinear would have is probably a better explanation. But you have words that are synonyms that are equal, okay, but they mightn't be as used. So we have that here in English. Or say back in their day, the word charity and love, they were very similar, but they had their distinct meaning. Charity is usually showing charity towards your Christian brethren, where love is different. It's not specifically just to Christians. And so it's quite interesting going through different words in the King James and why they used sometimes for the same Greek word. And so we were looking at Easter and Passover and how they made these clear distinctions. Now, they specifically didn't use the word rhinoceros, okay? Now, the word rhinoceros is just an older way of saying rhinoceros, okay? So it's nothing that fancy. And so, I just sort of mentioned that sometimes it's like, it's an alternative reading. It's a bit like in New King James, you can just check the majority text says this, or the NU says this, the United Bible Society say that. It's not that type of alternative reading. So we can't get modern alternative readings and retroactively put them back onto what the King James guys are saying. But at the same time, we understand that they had synonyms, and sometimes, or when you go through the Vulgate, the Reem is translated as a rhinoceros type of words, right? Rhinocerotus and all these different Latin endings that I'm not really familiar with, but it's basically rhinoceros and unicornus. And so these seem like they were synonyms, and the English dictionary says that these many times get confused with each other. And one of the definitions of a unicorn is a rhinoceros. So it's just, to me, it's just a no-brainer. But anyway, let's just continue.
Worth understanding, even separately from the unicorn question, it's important to understand what do these indications mean. So I'm going to go quickly through a way of understanding the 1611 King James Version and its annotations and its other indications. So there are
So this is most probably from Scrivener, and this is what I found too when I was going through Timothy Berg's material. Now, that the marginal note material is only on Facebook, because I used to do everything on Facebook, but then I realized it's limited on YouTube. There's a lot more people. And so he would say, okay, Scrivener said that this dagger means this type of marginal note and the rest of it. And then you would have Scrivener saying, oh, the King James translators just simply doubted at this place. They didn't know what it meant and all the rest of it. And so I would study right into it, and no, they did know what it meant. They didn't doubt it. And they clearly translated it that way. And this word meant something else back in 1611, or it's an obsolete term, and so I just find that sometimes people are simply going to these type of references just to, it's another way of placing doubt upon what the King James translators did. So it's like, let's go to the marginal note. Oh, no, we have to assume they're all looking at each other like, you know, a deer looking at headlights going, I don't know what this means. I don't know how to translate this. Well, just put a marginal note there, you know. Well, they can figure it out, you know, sort of thing. It's not like that at all. What they have in the reading is what they decided on, what they agreed on. Sometimes even a marginal note only has to do with something that was in an older edition of the Bible, or an older edition of the Greek and the Hebrew texts, or just to a place where some people would study and might come to the wrong conclusion if they're not completely fluent in the language. And so it might have a little indicator, like say at Psalm 12, where it has, thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forth forever, where it has, I think it's the marginal note, us. So it shows that they know the issue, but this is how they correctly translate it. And so, sometimes the Greek and the Hebrew, they if you do a lexical search for words, you go, okay, well, that word should equal this, but in the context has changed. There's a contextual context. And so the King James knew this. The King James were fluent in these languages, and so they would put these little indicators just saying, look, I understand if you're going through and doing a basic sort of study, you might come with this conclusion, but obviously what we have in the main text is our main word. It's our main choice. This is what all the see, when I'm saying like 60 translators involved, I mean that. It's not like you get the New King James where you got 130 translators, or like I proved with the MEV that they only probably have one translator for that particular place in Isaiah, where they totally just use the word reward. And so they actually put that as reward, whether it's an archaic type of word for a rear guard, and they thought it said reward. So it proves they didn't go to the Hebrew; they just went to the King James. And I've proven most of these modern Bibles don't actually go to the Hebrew; they actually go to the King James, which is bizarre to me. But it's like say in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 3, it says most Bibles say, "Oh, the worlds were created, or the universe was made," and the King James has, by faith, we understand that the worlds were made, I think it's made or fashioned or something like that, by the word of God. And so when you understand that the word worlds there is the same word that's usually updated in the New King James as age, like the end of the age or the end of the world, you know, we see this New King James, Old King James sort of thing. It's the same word. So it should be the ages were formed by the word of God. So, and then it goes on to talk about these different ages, talking about, you know, okay, Enoch, he did this, and Moses, he did this, and Abraham, he did, you know, all these different ages were framed by the word of God. Not the universe was made by the word of God. And what you find is all these modern Bibles just follow the King James there, mistakenly thinking that world means the universe, or the world was created. So that's the type of sloppy, very lazy translational methodology that we see today. We look at it and we laugh at it and we say that that's ridiculous. Do these guys even know what they're doing? You know, I'm sure, you know, maybe if you get one or two or three people make that same mistake, but many times these translations have 50, 100, 200 people, or, I think it's the New King James has 130. Are they all looking at it? Are they all looking at these verses? How can they make so many mistakes if they're all looking at it, So this is the problem. They try to have this air that they're like the King James. The King James, every translator would have looked at this reading. They would have looked at this marginal note and said, yeah, that's really good. And so that's the difference. And I could explain through the superior translational methodology, but I think I've done that so many times in the past. If anyone has a problem with that, just read D.A. Waite's book. I think it's Defending the King James Bible, written in 1992. He has a whole section on the superior translational methodology. I do go into that a little bit in my second Easter video. Actually, my first Easter video. Yeah, my first Easter video in the second part. So probably around the 40-minute mark, I start talking about that, how they translated it and how superior that was and why that made the King James a book without translational error, because so many expert scholars were looking at it. So anyway, let's go through these definitions of what TurritinFan is saying are the marginal note indicators.
A number of indications. One of them is a font change. So as an example, if you look at verse 4, here you can see that the word fig, F-I-G-G-E, in this as a falling fig, as a falling fig, the word fig is supplied by the translators. There's not an original Hebrew word fig in the text. That's what that different font means. So this is a supplied word. It's not one of the original.
But not always. If you go through the Gospels, you can see sometimes Hosanna. I'm not sure which Gospel it is. It might be Matthew. It's in italics, but it's clearly there in the Greek. And that's when I was going through the 2016 edition, I thought, maybe what I should do is go back to the original 1611 italics, because there seems to be a lot fewer. And many times the italicized words, they're words that are implied if you just translate directly from Greek. It's, having the words like like, what's it in Matthew 1 where it has, from Abraham to Christ are 14 generations. You wouldn't just leave that out. From Abraham to Christ, 14 generations. No, you put 14 generations. It's just part of the natural way of translating across for us to make a complete sentence. But in the Blaney edition, they put them in italics, which I'm not really a great fan of, some of the italics, the extra italics that have been put in. But in 1611, some of the italics were for emphasis. Some of the italics in, say, 1 John chapter 2, verse 23, I think it is, where half the verse is in italics, is talking about an issue in the Greek. So sometimes you get a more modern Trinitarian Bible Society edition. They don't have that in italics, but they have one of the words, I think it's an and in there in italics. And so sometimes, having these definitive, okay, this is exactly what these italics were used for. There's just two examples of places where italics are different. And so anyway, I'll just sort of throw that in.
Original words of the text. Now, that's what the King James translators intended by that indication. And they think that the sense is there, but they needed to supply a word in order to make it work in English. Another example would be the words is and his at verse 2. The next type of indication is the asterisk indication. You can see it's here and here. This is at verses 4 and 5. And there's cross-references here to Revelation 6:14 and 6:13. So the asterisk indication is used for cross-reference purposes. Generally, this is not, this is just for the reader's benefit, for their use to go and find some other related scripture. Related according to the King James translators, of course. It's not supposed to be infallible or inspired, but it is what it is. Another indication is the dagger indication. Looks a little bit like a cross. The dagger indication is used to indicate a more literal translation of the original language, where the translators felt that a less literal translation conveys the sense better to the readers. So, for example, in verse 1, it says, all that is therein. But a more literal translation would be the fullness thereof. So here it says, come here, you nations, to hear, and hearken, you people, and let the earth hear. And a more literal translation would be, and the fullness thereof. But the King James translators thought that a way of explaining it better in English would be all that is therein. So they did that, but then they provided the literal Hebrew on the left. But the final indication is the double vertical line. And we see two examples of that in verse 7. These are alternative readings. And so the first example is unicorns. The alternative reading is rhinoceros, which is the plural of rhinoceros in the 1600s. And then the other one is, and their land shall be soaked with blood, but instead of soaked, an alternative reading here is drunken. So either soaked with blood or drunken with blood. And you can see the meaning is not that different, but it's a little different. There's a difference between being soaked with blood and being drunken with blood. Although, of course, maybe some people might use those words to a degree interchangeably. In any event, the bottom line is this double vertical line indication indicates alternative readings. And indeed, in this case, rhinoceros is an alternative reading. It's not the main text reading. Why in the world would they do this? This is something that the King James, pro-King James folks tend to get upset about or frustrated with. Is when we, who hold to the Reformation Bible, say it's appropriate for translators, it's right for translators, it's even better for translators to put in these kind of annotations. And we agree with the argumentation, the explanation, and the statements that are provided by the King James translators in their preface in the appropriate section. I'm going to read that section to you in part. You can read the whole thing, of course, at your leisure. The section is titled Reasons Moving Us to Set Diversity of Senses in the Margin Where There Is.
And so it's not so much that there are marginal notes that are a problem. It's how they're read and how they're defined by modern critical text people. So usually critics of the King James, they're like, well, it's just an alternative reading, or whenever you see the Hebrew says this or whatever, it's like, well, you can just cross out what the King James has there and place that straight on top of it, and that's just as good, sort of thing. And the thing is too, what people will do is say here rhinoceros. That's not a word that's probably been used, since the 1600s. And so since, it probably lasted maybe about 50 years after the King James, and then it's just died out. So you have to define, like I'm not saying in this case that it would make much difference, because we know in the study that we did last time where rhinoceros is just a rhinoceros. But sometimes the words can change the meaning. And so then people put in a modern definition and trying to squeeze that into the King James. It can create all sorts of problems. And see, the difference is these are there to be helpful to the modern, or to the reader of 1611. Where modern translations, the footnotes and the marginal notes are many times there to distract. They're there to point to a completely different Greek text, the Revised Version. They're there to point out where there's errors in the King James. It'll just say, Passover, Easter. It's like, I'll cross that out and just have Passover, It's usually there to change and morph the text to be more like the Revised Version, where this is more like they've got a definitive text here, and they're showing where if someone could look at unicorns, and because, like we were reading in the Oxford English Dictionary, unicorn and rhinoceros being many times synonymous, it just has it, or a rhinoceros, because some people they're like, a unicorn, are they talking about the mythical creature? And then here clearly they're saying, okay, we're not talking about the mythical creature here, we're talking about something that's real, like a rhinoceros. And then they're like, that makes sense. I mean, to me, that just makes perfect sense. It clarifies everything. But the thing is, if you're critical of the King James and you believe that they just made blunders, and if you believe that they thought that a unicorn here was the mythical creature, then they have all rhinoceros. It's like, it just confuses everything. This whole, wild ox thing, the Aurochs, whatever wild goats, whatever you want to put in there, has just confused everything. And there was really no confusion. Like when it's, and this is one of the things, that's why I've just basically on my article on unicorns, I've just put most of the time, just that one footnote clears it all up, because it says 20 different things. It says that the King James translators felt that unicorn and a rhinoceros was synonymous. As more we've studied that, we're still on the same answer. We haven't diverted from that. The Oxford English Dictionary says that in several places. And also the usage. TurritinFan's gone through and said, no, the usage is only the mythical creature, or I've proven there's a whole bunch of usage that he's not looking at that show that it's not the mythical creature. Yes, unicorn can mean one or the other, but obviously by them putting rhinoceros here, they're saying that that's not it, that it's not the mythical creature. They're talking about something that's real. They're talking about rhinoceros. So we've got a few comments here. I'll just quickly catch up on them. Docky is in the house. Helge is saying greetings from Norway. And everyone's loving that Helge is in the room. Doing the deep dive into the unicorns. Yeah, it's not something that I've thought we would need to do. It's to me, it's just so obvious. But it's like I was saying to Chris Yetzer. I was talking on the TR Academy, and I said, look, we really need to do a bit of a dive into Job chapter 17, verse 6, because Mark Ward says it means spit, means spit, because it makes a spit sound. So, that's his logic. Where I'm like, no, it's talking about a drum, a tabret, as the King James says. But, Chris Yetzer said, well, I'm sort of really convinced that it's the King James doesn't have an error here. So, and I said, look, I am too. But it's one thing to be convinced in your own mind, but it's a different thing to be convinced and to be able to convince the laity that that's what it means. And so I think I did that with my Easter article. I became completely convinced, but then I spent a lot of time, a lot of groundwork making videos and doing all sorts of things so that I could convince others of that position. And that's one of the things is many of us go, we look at something and go, oh, well, let's move on. But one of the things is with, say, that issue with Mark Ward, with the Job 17:6, he's saying that that's the only place that he's found an error of translation from the Masoretic text of the King James, or anywhere in the King James, that there's a translational error. But he says if you don't acknowledge there's translational errors, you're a Ruckmanite. Okay, so he said that in his latest videos. So if we actually disprove him on that point and get him to acknowledge, okay, it's probably not an error in Job 17:6, if he goes, okay, yeah, it does say drum there, yep, thanks for that, he instantly becomes a Ruckmanite. How daft is that? It's amazing when you go through his videos and you go through them slowly and you listen to what he's actually saying. It's like, it's all over the place. So Kept Pure in All the Ages says, Nick, TurritinFan is live right now and seems willing to talk live. Do you have a link share for stream out? I think, I don't think it's going to be profitable to talk live because it's not really dealing with what he's saying here. I'm open to talking live any other time, but I was just like, okay, I'm going to start doing this video, and I do these videos meticulously and go through everything that's said and go and look up all the instances and look up all the dictionaries and things like that. So I think a live chat it just wouldn't really help. I think if he wants to do that some other time, where after I've gone through these videos and we can have a chat, I think that'll be profitable. But I don't think it'll be profitable now. And I said to TurritinFan, I saw he was on Facebook, and I said, well, I'm about to go live in a few minutes. And then I noticed he was live. And so I'm not saying he's deliberately sort of coming against me or whatever, but it's I'm going to do my thing. He's doing lots and lots and lots of videos. I'm spending the time to go through them. This one went for 3 hours and 20 minutes. The previous one went for just under 3 hours. So I'm spending and investing a lot of time into these. So I don't want to just go, okay, we'll just sit there and just chat. I want to meticulously go through everything that he's saying here and then come out the other end and say, okay, well, you would have looked at my point of view, listened to my point of view. And see, the thing is, sometimes in the heat of debate, in the heat of just chit chat, you can miss pausing it, rereading something, getting into context, everything. Yeah. So sorry, I'm probably talking to you like I would to Turritin, so I don't really mean to do that. But yeah, so I guess this is probably going to be a better interaction just through video at the moment. But thanks for the offer. I really appreciate that. Let's let Turritin continue. So he's going to go through and talk about the margins and things like that.
Great probability for each. Great probability for each. So what they're saying is it says unicorns, but there's a great probability that it means unicorns and a great probability that it means rhinoceros. They are not saying they're certain about the text. The folks who are saying, oh no, we need a text that needs to be absolutely certain, it can't be changed, you can't be fooling around with the text, you can't be suggesting that they're...
Well, if a rhinoceros and unicorn are synonyms many times, it's not really an issue.
The meaning might be a little bit different. That this is somehow a choose your own Bible? No. This is not the argument of the King James translators. It's the argument of the enemy of the King James translators. And they anticipated this argument, not so much anticipated as knew of the argument, because it had been used against other folks had argued that you shouldn't do this. So it said some peradventure will have no variety of senses to be set in the margin, lest the authority of scriptures for the deciding of controversies by that show of uncertainty should be somewhat shaken. So what they're saying is, some people are saying, don't put marginal notes because that's going to cause a sense of uncertainty. People are not going to be certain about what does the text mean. And the King James translator said, nope, their judgment isn't sound. They go on to explain, it has pleased God in his divine providence here and there to scatter words and sentences of that difficulty and doubtfulness in matters of less moment, less significant matters. And what do they say are examples? There are many rare names of certain birds, beasts, and precious stones, about which the Hebrews themselves are so divided amongst themselves for judgment that they may seem to have defined this or that rather because they would say something than because they were sure of what they said, as Jerome says somewhere of the Septuagint. So Jerome recognized the problem, the King James translators recognized the problem, and we're facing that problem today with the mistake of the word unicorn here. But they that are wise had rather have their judgments at liberty in differences of readings than to be captivated to one when it may be the other.
And that's exactly the argument that I've made. Okay. So I've said clearly in the debate that unicorn is an umbrella type of term for any type of animal with one horn. Okay. So a narwhal, a mythical unicorn type creature, the rhinoceros, certain different types of rhinos, extinct animals. And so when you have unicorn, it's clearly putting it into that realm where it's like, okay, it could be, it's just a large animal with one horn. It's specifically saying it's got one horn. Okay. Now, by them saying all rhinoceros, then it opens up, well, it could be the Indian rhinoceros, which later on was called Rhinoceros unicornis. It could be that, or it could be an extinct type of rhinoceros. Okay. And so we've got to put ourselves into their feet in 1611, that they were looking perhaps at this creature here. A Carcharodon. So this is in about the year 1000. This literature came out. So things like this, there are pictures like this all over the world of different types of animals and different explanations from people. The Elasmotherium could have been that. And so to me, this is like, okay, it's called the Great Unicorn. But I would say it's sort of like a rhinoceros, a woolly rhinoceros or whatever. And so, the Carcharodon, the Lord of the Desert. So in English, it's a rhinoceros. So people just say the Carcharodon is the Indian rhino. Okay. So but I'm open to, I'm not like, okay, it's just definitely the Indian rhino. I mean, it all the evidence seems to point that way, but I'm open to it being this beast here as well. And so having unicorn as like an umbrella term for all of these, it just clears it up. And so, but the King James translators, they also had all rhinoceros or rhinoceros, which basically that limits all of those 9 places where unicorn appears to go, okay, that is a type of rhino. Okay, so it's not a horse with a mythical horse, or they understood that was around. There many times the artwork and things that are in, if you go to Hampton Court, if you go to some of the places where these translators frequented, they've got that type of artwork on the wall. They've got carvings of them. They've got, kings and queens with a unicorn's horn, mythical type of thing. They understood that. And so, so we've got some more comments. And so, so TurritinFan is a nice guy at Kept Pure. No worries, you're just both covering unicorn material, so I thought I'd ask. Yeah, so I really appreciate that. Thanks anyway. Also, greetings from Belfast, Jim D, Belfast. Been waiting for this vid. Nick, do you know of any KJV translators walking away saying this is wrong? There are non-critical text translators who have done this, like Frank Lodston. And so I understand about Frank. He was involved with the birth, I think it was, of the NASB. Was it the NASB? Anyway, I can't remember exactly which one it was, or the revised standard version or something like that. I can't remember. I think it was a revised standard version. And so he was saying that, yeah, he was involved with that. So there has been a bit of pushback on that. So this is something that usually, Gail Ripplinger, Ruckman, Gipp, and others usually sort of push this one forward, and people like James White and others push back on it. So I do know about it. I've read through the material and I'm just sort of left there going, I don't know. Some people were saying he wasn't really an important guy there. Other people were saying he was instrumental in the foundation of that issue. I don't know of any King James translator who walked away saying this is the wrong thing to do. There was a guy called Hugh Houghton who was quite an enemy of the King James. If you Google him, he wanted to be on the translation committee, but it was rejected. And so he wanted to sort of Hebrewize a lot of the names and things like that. And like Timothy Berg was like, oh, this guy's brilliant. He's a great guy. The King James guy should have listened to him. But when you go through his translation, which I went through some of his, what he translated, it was identical to the King James. And it's like, well, what's the difference? And then there was a change, and it was so abrupt and so strange that it was like none of the modern versions agreed. It was like, this guy's just trying to, when you get those versions and they're just really weird, or it will call Jesus like Yahweh or something, and it's like the Yehopia, and it's like, what? Or you just go, well, the translator, he's copying from somewhere, but he's all over the place. And so this guy was a smart guy, and he had a lot of criticisms of the King James, but I think most of them, when I read through them, I was like, this guy really doesn't know his stuff that as well as he's claiming. So we've got Docky says, I must undergo renounce every attachment to the New American Standard. That's the one. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. But I don't know of any King James translators who have done that. Teachers have 3 loaves: love of learning, love of learners, and love of bringing the first 2 loves together. Yeah, that's really interesting. And so I think the King James, with their marginal notes, they were helping people along to come to the conclusion that they have in the text. Not here, we've got this in the text, but it's probably wrong. That's sort of like what modern versions do. You're sort of reading along and you're like, okay, well, that's good. And then you read a footnote and you're like, oh, apparently that whole verse isn't in there. Sort of, it doesn't help you. It just makes you deflated every time you read these notes. And I know in the first few years of my Christianity, I was reading the New King James and I crossed out every single marginal note that was in the margin. And people were like, why are you crossing out things in your Bible? I'm like, oh, I'm crossing out these things in the middle that say this verse isn't in there. And because it was creating doubt. It was like having a Jehovah's Witness sort of standing on my shoulder saying, it's not really in there. And how can you trust your Bible? And I'm like, so I'm crossing them out. And even then I can still sort of read through the ink and I'm like, it was just very vexing to my spirit, even just as a young Christian. These things just annoyed me. And I guess that, that vexation is still there today when I see people tampering with the Word of God or trying to usurp the correct meaning of what the Bible says. So nice quote there. Frank Austin's statement in his audio testimony that he wrote the preface. So yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, there's a whole thing behind that. And I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying that it has been thrown up as not true, and I haven't really pursued it. Sometimes, like say, I've got a few books around, like the, like say this book. This is written by an Australian guy. Serious Omissions in the NIV Bible. Now, when I picked this up, this is probably like I've had this on the shelf for like 20 years. When you look at all the lists and things where it has things omitted and things deleted and all the rest of it, it's like, wow, that's really amazing. But then he has a whole section on 6 translators that lost their voice. And it goes through this Ankerberg show thing where someone lost their voice. Why did these translators lose their voice? So I might just put that there. And to me, this is really ridiculous. I'm not saying the Lawson thing is like that, but I'm just saying you just got to be careful. It talks about Westcott, Schaff, Kenneth Taylor, Tregillis, J.B. Phillips. Kenneth Taylor lost his voice. So they were saying, like on the Ankerberg show, Don Wilkins lost his voice, and so apparently he was talking and got some water, drank it, and was like, "It's okay, I'm fine." And they were saying, "See, you lost your voice. It's the judgment of God." And it was like, it's so cringy. It's like he obviously didn't lose his voice. And I actually critiqued one of his videos, like probably about 6 months ago, where he was talking all the way through, and I was just sort of like, actually, no, I didn't critique it. I just wrote underneath it that he was sort of waffling on a bit like Joe Biden. He had this one point to make, and it took him 30 minutes to do it. Now, I know he's getting old, and, we don't want to pick on seniors, but he's seen as a guy who you go to for the reading of the Word of God. And if he's not coherent, well, you shouldn't really go to him for the Word of God. And so, so with that issue, I haven't really made a definitive conclusion about Frank Logsdon. Okay, so let's let Turretin continue.
So again, the King James translators are saying, no, don't tell us that you're so sure of one meaning that you're not going to take away people's liberty to believe a different meaning, but especially when the text isn't completely clear as to which is the meaning. Now, the word in Hebrew is Reem.
Okay, so when you've got to take this into its context, that many times it's talking about, say, certain birds and stones and places where there's hapex legomenon, where there's only one word that appears. Now, this isn't the case. It's just talking about an animal. But even then, they're sort of like, okay, there are certain animals that we're not really that sure of. The Jews have, sometimes, had speculation about. They've said this is a such and such bird, or this is a penguin, or whatever they're saying it is, and Other people are saying, no, it's not. And so the Hebrews can be at loggerheads with themselves. But the thing is, the King James translators did the best that they possibly could. And in retrospect, when we look at what they've done, like what we're doing here with Unicorn, it was very, very, very good. See, the issue is the Vulgate has Unicornus and Rhinoceros for Reem, okay? The Septuagint has Monoceros or Monoceros, which is a one-horned animal. So all of these point to a one-horned animal. The King James has a unicorn, which is a one-horn. All of the previous English editions, I think except for the Douay Reims, have unicorn. So it's not like they're out of step with their whole generation or with the whole Latin Vulgate or with the Septuagint. It's almost like everything is in agreement. You're looking at 99.9% of all the evidence pointing towards this. And it's just, that's why I'm like, I can't see how you're getting around this. This is very clearly a stock standard reading. Rhino and a rhinoceros and a unicorn were synonymous.
There's no doubt about that. But what does it mean? That's where we're less sure. And of course, the Pope tried to do the same, but he's subject to the same afflictions and infirmities that others are. So even the Pope, who claims he can get a certain translation with no changes, not even, his translation is Latin. He says he can get it exactly right, no changes, but he's also human. Everybody's human, and the King James translators don't pretend that their translation is perfect, and in fact it isn't. This is an example of a place where it's not perfect.
Okay, so this is one of the things that I've pointed out. Miles Smith, who wrote the preface to the Reader, he had never seen perfection like that exists in the King James translation. Because when you look at, say, the Geneva Bible that was done under duress, most of them were exiles running away from Bloody Mary in England. They gathered in Geneva. They did their version. People like John Knox were involved and a whole bunch of others. Then when Elizabeth came in, they went back to England. Now, that translation is very good, but it's not. There are certain issues there. There are certain problems. It's a good Bible, but it's not as good as the King James. And so the Bishop's Bible, I think they had, 6 or 12 bishops? I think it was 6 that worked on that edition. And so when you go through that, they can do a very good job. But obviously, when you look in retrospect, there are a lot of errors there. That's why someone who wouldn't know about the cross-referencing translational methodologies that the King James translators used, if they were ignorant of that, then they would say the King James is a bad translation, and it's, thinking that there's only like 3 or 4 people who've made a decision on a certain word instead of 60 people making a decision. And I think, or 60 people involved with that decision. And so I think this is where, like Miles Smith, even though he's one of them, he's saying, okay, well, previously we've never seen perfection, so I doubt this is perfect. And he's almost apologizing in advance. Like, I remember I did this in a debate with Stephen Boyce. He said something about this, what was it, this Scrivener's list and blah, blah, blah. And he's going through this list, and I'm like, okay, well, sorry if I've said it wrong, but and I apologize if I've ever said that. And so he was like, later on, he was like, you apologize for that, so you're admitting fault. And I said, no, I was apologizing if I did that. And what I did is I went through all the information that I'd ever said, went through all the written information, all the audio information, video information, and I'd never said it. But I was apologizing anyway because he was saying I said it. And he was saying, well, you said it. I was like, no, just because I apologize for something doesn't mean that I did it. If you said, hey, you were rushing through the supermarket and you banged a toddler on their head and they fell over and you didn't realize and you walked out, I'm like, oh, sorry if I did that. It doesn't mean I'm admitting guilt. It means I'm sorry if. The King James translators, Miles Smith, he was just being extra humble here. He's saying, look, we've done the best that we can possibly do. And I think it's the best that any human can do, any group of humans can do. And he's like, well, but there's still probably going to be mistakes anyway. And then we go, okay, let's have a look, go through, study it. And it's like, well, Miles, you actually apologized for something that you didn't do. You got it right. You cracked it. So this is the thing, getting into the mindset of these translators, getting in the mindset of Miles Smith. He's never seen perfection before like this. He's used to reading through the Geneva, and then 50 years later, it's like, oh, I guess we're going to have to mop up some of this, and the bishops, it's like, okay, well, yeah, we have to mop up that as well. And so he's sort of thinking, well, yeah, I guess later on people are going to have to mop this up, but they haven't had to. And so in retrospect, we can see that the King James is without errors. And so I think that's a very good thing to understand about Miles Smith. So we've got a whole bunch of high fives happening in the chat. And Shati says, do any of these critics ever look at the previous translations before the King James, before criticizing the King James? On a lot of these occasions, they are the same translation as previous translations, like the Bishops or the Great Bible. So it's quite interesting that you mentioned that. So I'll just throw this page up. So I've got numbers 23, 22, Bishops, unicorn, Geneva, unicorn, Great Bible, unicorn, Matthew's Bible, unicorn, Coverdale, unicorn, even Wycliffe, unicorn. And I thought, oh, wow, in the first one, it's all unicorn. Then I went through the second, unicorn, unicorn, unicorn. I was like, oh, everything's unicorn. Deuteronomy, unicorn, unicorn. I'm like, oh, this is sort of getting tiring. Unicorn, unicorn. One of them has him. Okay, so the him being representative of the unicorn. So in the style of English back in the Matthews and Coverdale Bible, and these are very similar Bibles, it does have Reem there, but you don't always have to have it, especially if it's mentioned of what it is. So here we have in verse 9, it's mentioned, it says like, will the unicorn be so tame as to do ye service, or to abide in thy crib? Cast thou bind ye yoke about him in thy furrows. So obviously the word there is Reem, but they've just put him there, which is a perfectly acceptable pronoun. So, but it does, they've got unicorn in the verse before. So obviously if they were going to have that word, they would have unicorn there. These other ones, unicorns. Now, for some reason, I couldn't find this. I was going through a lot of source material, but I couldn't find it. Was wrong on the Textus Receptus Bible site. They had the wrong psalm there. I think because Wycliffe numbers his psalms. He says this is the 28th psalm or whatever, 22nd psalm, and it's actually wrong. It's like it's like the 25th psalm or something. So a young unicorn, son of a unicorn, horn of a unicorn, like a unicorn, of a unicorn, So we're looking at everywhere is unicorn, everywhere in the English language. King James comes along, does the same. It's wrong. So not only is TurritinFan saying the King James is wrong, he's saying all the Bishops Bible guys are wrong, the Geneva Bible guys are wrong, the Great Bible guys, Matthews, Coverdale, Wycliffe, and in some places it's Tyndale. Wrong. Everyone's wrong. And now it's a wild ox. So to me, it's quite amazing. That's why I'm a bit dumbfounded at the whole thing, because the dictionaries say that unicorn and rhino are synonymous. The King James have, unicorn and rhino as, sort of like synonyms, have a marginal note saying all this, which is just to enhance the meaning. It's not saying it's a mythical creature. All the Latin, rhinoceros or unicornus, all the Greek, monoceros. It's almost everything. It's this whole wild ox thing just doesn't have a leg to stand on. Let's continue.
But in other words, the marginal notes are not clarifications of the meaning. They're alternate meanings because there's some uncertainty.
No, they are clarifications as well. So this is where when people get dogmatic about what the marginal notes are or aren't, sometimes that they're creating this out of thin air. At times, it is like just a synonym, but at other times, it's giving you a direction because it can be viewed like, say, I'm going to find one now. Revelation 13, 16, 11. I really like this site, the King James Online. I wish that I'd made this type of thing when I first did my Textus Receptus site. Okay. It's 13. So I can look at 13. I'm pretty sure I was looking at 13. Okay, and so I guess that's a different one because it does have a cross on it. So it doesn't have the double lines there. But this is, an example of a marginal note. I'll just go through it anyway while we're here. So Greek to give, and so it has, he calls us all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their forehead. Now it has to receive, but it has Greek to give. So is he giving or receiving? Well, it's actually the same Greek word. It means to give and means to receive. So they're just putting that there that, hey, guys, if you're studying through this and you come to the conclusion it means to give, us scholars, we've looked at this. We understand that in the lexical definition, it does mean to give as well as to receive. But in this context, it actually means to receive. Okay. So I'm just looking for a double-lined one that I can... Okay, so it has all names here. Upon the head, the name of blasphemy, or names. Okay, so the Greek can be either name or names. So they've chosen to go with name. So to me, it's just a clarification or figure. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, or sign. I mean, signs, wonders, and miracles. There can be a difference when it's talking about from God, but from Satan, I guess it's just a sign. And so they're saying it's a sign from heaven, or it's a wonder from heaven. So having that there and having, or a sign, because it's like, oh, a wonder in heaven. It's like, oh, just something bright happened, but people would recognize that this is like a sign. This is, behold, a great dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. It's like, this is an amazing sign. This is an indication. This is a wonder. And so to me, these things are synonymous, just clarifying, bringing more clarity to the other word. Anyway, so I'll just drop that down. And I might close that and we'll just continue.
Or at least there was uncertainty in the minds of the King James Version translators. And in this verse, they were right to be uncertain, because in fact, it's probably neither of their choices, neither unicorn nor rhinoceros. At least in the case of Isaiah 34:7, the King James Version translators were not.
Hang on. I'm just going to rewind what he said there. So 38:8.
Because there's some uncertainty, or at least there was uncertainty in.
So if you're clarifying something, you're uncertain. You know what I'm saying? Like, if it's a sign or if it's a wonder in heaven, it's something to be amazed at. But it's also, like in the marginal note, says this is like a type of sign, which is synonymous. But the better reading, the King James translators felt the better reading was wonder, and sometimes that can go through. There might be a whole bunch of other wonders that happened in the book of Revelation, and they've found that that was the best word to go with. Where sign could get translated as something different, some sort of religious sign or something. I don't know, but for whatever reason, they didn't put that there. But they felt that that's part of knowing the other word, wonder and sign. It's like, okay, it creates a full picture there. And so it's not always an alternative reading, but let's listen to what he's saying.
In the minds of the King James Version translators. And in this verse, they were right to be uncertain, because in fact, it's probably neither of their choices, neither unicorn nor rhinoceros.
So now they're uncertain about unicorn, and they're uncertain about rhinoceros, because they've put this word rhinoceros there to clarify that it's not a mythical creature like people like TurritinFan are saying. So they've put rhinoceros there, not as like, oh, we don't know what it's saying, and so we're all scratching our head. It's like, should we put rhinoceros? I don't know, just put something there, guys. Just fill in the blanks. Just like they're playing Tetris or something. Just put that thing straight down the bottom there. Let's move on. No, they've thoughtfully gone through this word unicorn. Then they're saying, well, what if people think that it's the mythical unicorn? And it's like, okay, well, how about what we'll do is we'll put all rhinoceros there, and then there's no way that they can get around that. They have to admit it. But then someone like TurritinFan comes along and says, both of these readings are wrong. There's a really noisy tap thing happening. Both of these readings are wrong, and both of them are in doubt, because the King James got them. Both of these readings are in error. Like, how's that? So I'll just rewind that again, because it's quite remarkable when you go through this nice and slow.
Because there's some uncertainty, or at least there was uncertainty in the minds of the King James Version translators.
They're uncertain.
And in this verse, they were right to be uncertain, because in fact, it's probably neither of their choices, neither unicorn nor rhinoceros.
Now, instead of having unicorn and going, yep, that's the reading, that's what the King Jameses have, translators, all of them are in agreement, we're going to go with that reading. And someone has gone wisely, said, how about we have a marginal note there and saying it's a rhinoceros and not a mythical creature? It's like, yeah, we'll do that in the last one. So they're studying through and they can see, oh, yeah, unicorn, yeah, that's a rhinoceros. Oh, so it's not the mythical creature. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so they're going, they're doing that to bolster your faith. TurritinFan says, no, they're doing that because they don't know what they're doing. They got both of them wrong. They got the unicorn wrong. They're like, oh, that's a mythical creature. It's a, like a horse with, I guess, like a Pegasus. You may as well put Pegasus there, I guess. Just make up whatever you want. And rhinoceros is a mistake too. They're both just errors. And so can't you see how instead of bolstering faith, like the King James translators would want us to know and understand that this is a type of unicorn, but it's most probably a rhinoceros. But they haven't put rhinoceros in the main reading there because I guess, like me, they're not sure whether it's some other ancient type of rhinoceros or it's the one that's right in front of them that they've seen pictures of. It's in zoos and things like that around the country, and that they can go and have a look at it and go, wow, that's a rhinoceros. And so just to go, okay, well, both of those readings are wrong, and they're in doubt. Where I'm looking at the same picture going, no, this clarifies the meaning. It means it's not the mythical thing that TurritinFan's talking about, and it doesn't produce doubt. It produces confidence in the reading. Like, how can you be looking at the same thing but seeing it from such different angles? And to me, it's just the bias of someone who's critical. So Ishati says, where did he come to the conclusion that the translators were uncertain? Did he read any statements that they had made? I missed the beginning of this video. Well, basically, it's like the critical text people, when they're usually going through the preface to the reader or they're going through marginal notes, instead of looking at these marginal notes as helps, they look at them like, oh, they didn't really know what they were doing. So they put this marginal note. They're saying you can choose that as well. It can be either way. We're not really sure. So these marginal notes, instead of like, oh, we know exactly what we're doing here, but just in case you're doing a study and you come up with this silly notion, or we'll clarify it and say this is exactly what it says in the Greek, or we'll clarify it with a synonym, or we'll do something there with it. Or we'll show you what older Bibles had, like the Bishops or the Geneva, which we don't agree with, because if we did, we'd have it in the main text. So they're not coming from a place of doubt. They're coming from a place of learning. And they're showing people who are less learned, hey, this is what it's saying here. Here's either a synonym, here's either an older reading. Sometimes it's an older TR reading or a marginal note or something in the TR. And they're pointing that, saying, we understand and we recognize that word is there. Like, say, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 11, it has, or Jacob, as part of the genealogy. Now, the King James translators weren't in doubt. They weren't saying, oh, we think maybe Jacob should be in there, maybe it shouldn't be. They were like, no, it's out, because they left it out of the main text. But they're like, well, what about people who are reading the Geneva and the Bishops, which have that reading? They would think we've just made a mistake there. So they're like, we'll just put a marginal note saying, or Jacob, let them know that we've fixed that. So that's what they were getting, all the good Bibles, and they were creating one principal good one. So in the process, they had to explain things in the marginal notes without violating the King's rule that it wouldn't have marginal notes. So in other words, it's just got tiny little things here and there that just point you in a certain direction. Most critical text people see these and interpret these as places where they're all sitting around in doubt, going, I don't know what this means. Because they admitted that sometimes there's a hapax legomenon, where there's one word that just appears out of the blue. It might be a rock or a bird or a beast or something, and they're like, what do you think that is? And so they've gone through and scoured everything, come to the best conclusion, but they're still going, well, maybe in 50 years someone will discover something, or some new light will shine on this information, and people will be able to say, oh, that's what it means. But that hasn't happened. And when we're talking about the unicorn, especially since they clarified it with their footnote of rhinoceros, obviously this is talking about something like the Indian unicorn or the crocodile, which is basically, they say it's an Indian unicorn anyway. So it's some type of a unicorn type creature. Rhinoceros type creature. I'm saying the unicorn translates as unicorn. No, it translates as rhinoceros. So, when we're looking at places of doubt, it's usually places anywhere where there's a marginal note is apparently a place of doubt. And this is where Timothy Berg takes this to its ultimate conclusion, where he's like, any marginal note is just a place where the King James guys are admitting that they're all just sitting around scratching their head going, oh, I don't know what's happening. I don't know, can someone make me a strong coffee? I've got a headache, and just put anything in the margin. We don't know. Let them decide. Which is sort of like what the New King James does today. It's like choose your own Bible. It's what they have, the Nestle alarm with the apparatus. Choose your own adventure. And so you have Turritin having the NA28 and the apparatus. So you can sort of read anything into the text that you really want. So there's no definitive text.
At least in the case of Isaiah 34:7, the King James Version translators were not saying that rhinoceros is another word for unicorns. They're saying that it's a viable alternative. The King James...
Okay, so they're not saying it means that, but they're saying it's a viable alternative. No, I would say that they're saying that this is a rhinoceros is a unicorn. Okay, so it's like, which specific unicorn are they talking about? The fish? No. Are they talking about the mythical one? No. Are they talking about the beetle? No. They're talking about the rhinoceros. That makes sense. We're going in that direction. To me, it's just so clear.
James translators were almost certainly aware of the fact that the Vulgate did not always translate Reem as unicorn. Sometimes it translated it as unicorn, sometimes as rhinoceros.
And I mentioned this in the debate, so I guess that's why he's put it in the information here.
You can see that at Numbers 23, Numbers 24, Deuteronomy 33, Job 39. In all those places, it's rhinoceros, not unicorn. And
so doesn't that show you that rhinoceros and unicornus are synonymous, just like the Oxford English Dictionary clearly says? Let's have a look. Okay, so it says here, used in Middle English versions of the Old Testament to render the Vulgate unicornus or rhinoceros. So they're saying these are the same. The Vulgate unicornus and rhinoceros. The Greek is monoceros or monokuros, and translated from the Hebrew reem. And so they're saying that these are synonymous, okay? And so when we get to 1611, they're saying unicorn and rhinoceros are also synonymous. So it's pretty clear. That's just from the Oxford English Dictionary.
Interestingly, Isaiah 34:7 is a place where it is unicorn. So we can't accuse the King James translators here of just blindly following the Vulgate. They are following the Vulgate reading by saying unicorns, but they have also suggested that rhinoceros here is a viable alternative. And you may remember that drunk was the other alternative to soaked, and drunk is the Vulgate reading here. So again, in this case, they haven't strictly followed the Vulgate's reading, but they've listed the Vulgate alternative as a viable alternative.
And see, this is the thing. They're dealing with the Vulgate. They're dealing with how the Vulgate was translated into, say, the Reams. They're looking at also the update of the Vulgate, the Clementine Vulgate of 1592. They're looking at those issues as well, and many times marginal notes and footnotes. So sometimes they're specifically putting footnotes and marginal notes in specific verses, knowing that these things later on, these things get mentioned in other editions, or say it's a marginal note in the Bishops or in the Douay or something like that. In the Reams, Douay Reams. Was it Douay first? I think it was a Douay edition first, then it was Reams, and then it was called the Douay Reams. Anyway, let's continue. Okay, we'll just go through some of this chat. So Helge says, I would count Psalm 92:10 as proof that this was a one-horned animal, but my horn shalt thou exalt, like the horn of an unicorn. The words in italics is saying like that of an unicorn. Yeah, absolutely. And so my horn shall thou exalt like the horn of a unicorn. Yeah. Modern versions agree with like that of, though they have wild ox. It is implied in the original text, my horn, singular, corresponds with what follows. Yeah, it's very good. And so I was also looking at the KJV today, KJV today. .net, and we were looking at unicorn. Well, I read this last time, so I won't read the whole thing again, but there is an article here which basically goes through Deuteronomy 33:17, where it's talking about the species of the unicorn, in a sense where he's showing that other Bibles say like cows and bears will eat together in peace, lions will eat hay as the oxen do, and so they're plural nouns, but they're all singular in the Hebrew. So when, like, if I was to say a lion is a very ferocious animal, I'm not just talking about one lion, I'm talking about all lions. And so that's what it's talking about in Deuteronomy 33:17, and this is something that's missed. That TurritinFan keeps defaulting back to this verse later on in this video, saying it's plural, it's plural, it's plural. You know, why have they done this? And clearly they've done it because they're talking about the species, not that they're talking about the whole entire range of unicorns. It starts saying a human is a very complex biological machine or whatever. You're talking about humankind, every human, not just James White.
Nick argues, and you can look here, but he says that the exact term for rhinoceros, he says that or rhinoceros, which was the exact term for the rhinoceros in 1611, derived from the Latin unicornus and Greek monoceros.
Yeah.
Both meaning one-horned and both referring emphatically to the rhinoceros. No. In fact, no. There was different Latin words and...
So you notice? No. There were different Latin words, okay, so listen to it.
Greek words for
different Latin words and Greek words.
Rhinoceros. Rhinoceros is, of course, a Greek word. The word rhino and ceros. Rhino is the Greek for nose. A rhinoplasty is when you get a nose job. Ceros is the word for horn. Our word keratin comes from that.
Okay, so again, Oxford English Dictionary. But, I'm going to expect this error to keep coming up all the way through the video, even though I'll be on my 5th video on this. It'll be the same mistake, but and it does get worse. So the unicorn at various times has been identified or confused with the rhinoceros, so that they're synonymous in many cases. Okay, so then we look at the biblical use. These versions render the Vulgate's unicornus or rhinoceros, so they're the same. They're synonymous in Latin, and they both equal monoceros or the monoceros, and they all are as translations of Reem. Okay, so Reem equals unicornus, it equals rhinoceros, it equals monoceros, and it equals unicorn. It's pretty clear. It's like, how many other languages do you want? Should I go through this? I don't need to go through the Syriac and go through the other ones. It's like the main ones are all there pointing in this direction. It's like, and then they've got the biblical things there. Then we got number 7 here, a one-horned animal, a rhinoceros. So this is under unicorn here. So it says number 7, a one-horned animal, a rhinoceros, and it's obsolete. How can you let's just? I know I'm getting frustrated, but it's because obviously TurritinFan didn't read through the Oxford English Dictionary like he should. He just sort of skimmed through a little bit of the surface material and sort of thought that it was bolstering his side. But let's just go through. So we're at 40:09. So let's go to 30 seconds before, 40 seconds before.
Or rhinoceros, which was the exact term for the rhinoceros in 1611, derived from the Latin unicornus and Greek monoceros, both meaning one-horned and both referring emphatically to the rhinoceros. No. In fact,
no. So not only are we going, so we got the Shati is pulling up all the unicornus, unus one, corno, horn, an animal with one horn, the monoceros or monoceros, the Greek. This name is often applied to the rhinoceros. So there you go. It's like, so this is Webster's. The sea unicorn is a fish of the whale kind, called narwhal, also called narwhal, remarkable for a horn growing outside its nose, a fowl, fossil unicorn, fossil's unicorn horn, a substance used in medicine, and it's got some Latin there, and that's the Webster's. Okay, so Webster's points there. Oxford emphatically points there. So he's saying I'm wrong here. Okay, and so let's read through what I've said slowly. And I've got in the margin it says rhinoceros, which is the exact term for a rhinoceros in 1611, derived from the Latin unicornus and the Greek monoceros or monoceros, both meaning one horn and both emphatically referring to the rhinoceros. So this is what Webster's saying. This is what the Oxford is saying. This is what the Latin is referring to. This is what the Septuagint is referring to. This is what all the older English Bibles are referring to. I mean, if you can't see it, it's Anyway, I get a little bit frustrated when we've got everything on our side. It's sort of like, 1 + 1 = 2, and it's like, okay, Einstein thought that, and this mathematician thought that, this guy thought that, sort of like everyone. So obviously the revised versions come along and said wild ox, and so they've had to make up why. And 150 years later, TurritinFans, they're saying it's wild ox, and we're just looking at it going, man, you just need to study the usage. You need to study these things out a little bit more carefully before you're saying I'm wrong. So, oops.
All those places, it's rhinoceros, not unicorn. Nick argues, and you can look here, but he says that the exact term for rhinoceros, he says that or rhinoceros, which was the exact term for the rhinoceros in 1611, derived from the Latin unicornis and Greek monokeros, both meaning one-horned and both referring emphatically to the rhinoceros. No, in fact, no. There was different Latin words and Greek words for the rhinoceros. Rhinoceros is, of course, a Greek word. The word rhino and ceros, rhino is the Greek.
So I guess synonyms didn't exist in the ancient world.
For nose, a rhinoplasty is when you get a nose job. Ceros is the word for horn. Our word keratin comes from that term, that word.
Okay, so he's going back into the Oxford. So we already dealt with that in video 1, but he's going to just jump back into the Oxford. Let's have a look.
The links there on my blog are just links to that 20th century Oxford English Dictionary. But contrary to his implication, the margin indicates just the opposite of what Nick said. Or rhinoceros means that unicorn doesn't mean rhinoceroses, but that the alternative is a possible alternative interpretation. Moreover, while the Greek word monokeros or rhinoceros may have a broad meaning in Greek today, I don't know. I leave that open if indeed it does have a broad meaning today. The Vulgate Latin and this distinguishes between unicorn and rhinoceros by using 2 different words, as we noted above. And it appears that the Greek word typically did refer to a mythical beast, as evidenced by the quotation from Pliny the Elder. And the word rhinoceros in English does come from Greek words, as I mentioned before.
So he's not only ignoring the fact that, Oxford English Dictionary is showing that these are synonymous and they translate into one another, but then he's turning around and saying that the Greek word did typically refer to the mythical beast, and then he's talking about Pliny. Okay, so I'll go through Pliny again. Whoops. Wrong one. Here we are. So let's go through Pliny. Okay, let's see if this is specifically talking about a mythical creature, an exceedingly wild beast called the monoceros, one-horned. It makes a deep lowing noise, and one black horn, 2 cubits long, projects from the middle of its forehead. This animal, they say, cannot be taken alive. Where is this showing that it's mythical? So and that's the thing. He's using these now as references. He's gone through a lot of this stuff. Oh, they're all mythical. No, that's mythical too. That's mythical. And every instance where someone just even mentions a unicorn, it's a mythical one. And then so now later on, he's going through and coming against the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, I wonder if Pliny, this would be an interesting thing to look at, but it would be hard to, it wouldn't have it actually, because it's a translation from Pliny. I can't remember if he writes in Latin or Greek. If it was like a Latin edition, perhaps even in the Liddell and Scott. Got my old Liddell and Scott here. Let's look up monoceros, and I might show Pliny here. Sorry about how this makes for a boring video, but it is going to be an in-depth study for the next few videos, actually. So, mono. Monoceros. One-horned. A unicorn. I'm not joking. Okay, so this is Little and Scott. Yeah, I'll just find a little pointer, a little pen or something. It's the second one down, so it should be pretty easy. So yeah, up the top there, Monoceros. It has Monoceros, one-horned, as a substitute, a unicorn. I mean, you know, it's just amazing. Anyway, let's just continue. Throw that over there.
Aquila's translation, which is an alternative Greek translation to the Septuagint, substitutes rhinoceros for monoceros in Job 39:9 and Psalm 29:9, according to the, I say LSG lexicon. I think it should be LSJ lexicon. Again, I may need to double check some of there's a few typos in here. Try to improve it shortly.
That's the one I just read, isn't it? Little Scott and Jones. So I actually got ahead of that. For some reason, I just thought I'd grab that off the shelf. So that's Little and Scott's. And so I guess it's Little and Scott's Greek, LSG. So anyway, they have updated ones of that, and usually it's favorable to the revised version.
Now, if you go to Nick's webpage, you'll see lots of different Bibles listed. One of the odd omissions is the Douay-Rheims Bible. The Douay-Rheims Bible was last up.
Now, the only reason I haven't put the Douay-Rheims in is because, to me, if you go through what's already on my page, it's convincing enough. That even just the Oxford English Dictionary, you go, wow, that's what it means. If you read it thoroughly. If you look at the marginal note in 1611, wow, convincing enough. But then if you look at all the translations ever in English, they're all unicorn, before 1611. To me, that's evidence enough. But then if you understand the definitions of unicornus, rhinoceros, and monoceros in Latin and in Greek, you come to the same conclusions. You're like, wow, that they're correct. And so all of these point to the King James being correct. And so to go into like the Douay-Rheims, and I could go, and eventually this article will be huge on my website, because I'm doing a deep dive into it now, opening up a whole bunch of pages. So I'll be copying and pasting stuff, and I'll put in all this Douay-Rheims material. So it's not like I'm deliberately leaving stuff out. It's just like, this is really easy. Look here, look at the marginal note. It says, "Oh, rhinoceros." There you go. Case closed. Let's move on. People are like, no, it's still a mistake. So, okay, Oxford English Dictionary, that should please you. No, still a mistake. All the English dictionaries beforehand, no, still a mistake. Okay, the Greek and the Latin, no, still a mistake. It's like, I haven't gone to the Douay-Rheims, and it's like, okay. So anyway, let's have a look at the Douay-Rheims.
Update, or the last major update, was the 1752, and if you go there, you'll see that it has the 1752 has rhinoceros in several places and unicorns in other places, including at one place where the King James doesn't have it. The reason the King James doesn't have it there is the word Reem is not in Psalm 78 in the King James Bible. It shouldn't be there either in the Douay-Rheims Bible, because it should be, they ought to have been translating from Hebrew, not from Latin. I don't know whether the Latin matches up there, but the Douay-Rheims translators usually did a pretty accurate translation of the Latin to English. So I would be surprised if it wasn't there in the Latin that they were working from. But the original Douay-Rheims Bible was published in 1582 for the New Testament and 1610 for the Old Testament. So although the update is from the 1700s, there was an original printing of a Roman Catholic Old Testament in 1610, just before 1611. Numbers 23:22, unlike the 18th century version, does have unicorn at 22, but does say horns of an unicorn, the plural horns and a singular unicorn, in Deuteronomy 33, and has rhinocerot at Numbers 24:8. There is rhinoceros at Job 39, 9 through 10, with a marginal note there indicating a possible alternative of unicorns. You can see they kind of went the opposite way. I don't know if you can see this well. I'm going to try to zoom it a bit. You can see this down here. It says unicornes. And you see the V at that time. The V and the U were not differentiated, but this and it's actually getting blocked slightly by my video. But anyway, this is unicornes as the alternative reading for rhinoceros, which is the main text reading. So it's indicated only at verse 9, but of course it would also apply at verse.
So the duo Reems agrees with me. Anyway,
verse 10, without a doubt.
We'll go through some of these comments. Shay T is on a roll here. Certain poetical passages of the Bible refer to a strong and splendid horned animal called Reem. This word was translated unicorn or rhinoceros in many versions of the Bible. But many modern translations prefer wild ox, Aurochs, which is the correct meaning of the Hebrew Reem. As a biblical animal, the unicorn was interpreted allegorically in the early Christian church. So that's Encyclopedia Britannica. Isn't the Douay Reem's Bible a Jesuit Bible? Yes, it is. And it's translated from the Latin, which is interesting.
So the relevance of the Textual Bible translation is relatively minor, but it provides two interesting tidbits of evidence. First, it does show that there was a distinction in the mind of educated English-speaking folks in the early 1600s between unicorn and rhinoceros.
What's the distinction? Let's just go back to when he had this screen up here. Doesn't it say rhinoceros will serve thee, thou shalt, and it has the marginal note unicorn? So aren't they saying that these are the same thing? Like,
but this and it's actually getting blocked slightly by my video. But anyway, this is unicornes as the alternative reading for rhinoceros, which is the main text reading. So it's indicated only at verse 9, but of course it would also apply at verse 10, without a doubt. So the relevance of the Textual Bible translation is relatively minor, but it provides two interesting tidbits of evidence. First, it does show that there was a distinction in the mind of educated English-speaking folks in the early 1600s between unicorn and rhinoceros. While there was some question as to which animal was intended in some places, this question was addressed through the use of a marginal note in both translations.
So wouldn't that also agree with me that a unicorn being an umbrella term for a narwhal, for a rhinoceros, or for a mythical creature, or for a beetle, that it, defining it and saying, okay, it's for a rhinoceros? Wouldn't that be part of it, and saying it's synonymous with a rhinoceros?
I couldn't quickly locate a digitized version of the original 1534 text of Luther's Bible, but I did find the 1545, and there are 8 references there for the German word unicorn, which is Einhorn. And it's the same verses as the King James Version, except that in Job 39:10, there's a pronoun referring back to the Einhorn rather than repeating the word. So
yeah, and so that would be very similar to what happened with Coverdale's Bible, which is quite interesting, because when you look at some of these earlier Bibles, I think it's the Coverdale, it says translated, and it actually says also from the Dutch, which I'm assuming back then would have meant the German. And so what you see is Luther doing his translation, but other people were going, oh, Luther's done his. We don't have to learn Greek and Hebrew. We can just translate it over from the Dutch. And so they were doing that in some of these earlier ones after Tyndale. And so I've got the Luther Bible right up here on the shelf. And I'll just have a quick look. Okay, so we'll go to Isaiah. (34) and 7. Einhorner Okay, so it has Einhorner. Now, this is a modern one. I got this from the Trinitarian Bible Society. So I think it's actually printed by someone else, but Einhorner. So pretty much everything has unicorns.
Oh, that German translation there is consistent with the King James Version. The 1588 Geneva Bible, not the English Geneva Bible, but the French one, the Bible Genève, has licorne, which is the French word for unicorn, with a marginal suggestion of rhinoceros at Numbers 23:22, but not a separate marginal reading for Numbers 24:8, probably because they're on the same page and because there's a cross-reference back to the previous verse. There is licorne in the text and rhinoceros in the margin in Deuteronomy 33:17, and there's the same artifact that there's horns plural and the beast's name is singular in Deuteronomy 33:17. And the versification of Job 39 is different from the King James Version, but rhinoceros is offered as a marginal reading next to the verse pair at Job 39:12-13, both of which have licorne. And Psalm 22 has licorns without any marginal reading, as do these other places where the French Geneva Bible translators translated. So again, the French Geneva Bible uses unicorn throughout, but more often than the King James Version suggests rhinoceros as a marginal reading, as an alternative reading, perhaps better than unicorn. And what does this?
Yeah, perhaps better than no. It's defining what type of unicorn it is. And I guess it's frustrating for him, like for me, to just see him constantly going back to this type of methodology where he's just trying to read in to everything, all the evidence. I mean, can't you see in the even in the French Geneva, they got similar. They got the unicorn, which is a French equivalent. In the Luther, they got the Einhorn. In the French, they've got the rhinoceros there. But the King James are bad; they're wrong. But everyone else has got the same thing. It's sort of like everyone's wrong. Everyone. And also, it's not just a clarification to have rhinoceros there. It's an alternative reading. You can just cross out the other one and put the other one directly in there. It's like, there's no other way that you can define a marginal note. It can't be a clarification. It can't be anything but an alternative reading where they were doubtful, sort of thing.
This tells us that the King James Version translators, the Reem Bible translators, and the French translators in Geneva were all aware of both unicorns and rhinoceroses, and they usually translated, almost all of them, usually translated it as unicorn and put rhinoceros occasionally as a marginal reading in the King James Version, even more often as a marginal reading in the Geneva French, and sometimes actually as the main reading in the Reem Bible. It's not clear to me whether Luther recognized the difference when he did his translation work in the German Bible, the German Luther Bible. So I can't speak to that. Someone who has done more research on Luther might know. I actually know a guy who would be a great resource on that, and perhaps I'll ask him and see if he has an answer. But for now, number 3, what about rhinoceros as a meaning?
Okay, so I'm going to go back about a minute because he does sort of skip past some things.
Is licorne in the text and rhinoceros in the margin in Deuteronomy 33:17. And there's the same artifact that there's horns plural and the beast's name is singular in Deuteronomy 33:17. And the versification of Job 39 is different from the King James Version, but rhinoceros is offered as a marginal reading next to the verse pair at Job 39:12-13, both of which have licorne. And Psalm 22 has licorns without any marginal reading, as do these other places where the French Geneva Bible translators translated. So again, the French Geneva Bible uses unicorn throughout, but more often than the King James Version suggests rhinoceros as a marginal reading, as an alternative reading, perhaps better than unicorn. And what does this tell us?
Perhaps better than unicorn.
Tells us that the King James Version translators, the Douay-Rheims Bible translators, and the French translators in Geneva were all aware of both unicorns and rhinoceroses. And
they would have all been aware that many creatures were called unicorns because they had one horn. But when you specifically narrow it down to a rhinoceros, you're not including the beetle, you're not including the mythical creature, you're not including the narwhal, you're not including anything else that has just one horn. You're specifically saying this is like a type of rhinoceros. Okay. So to me, it's just amazing that it's almost like this is exactly what I would put on my website and go, see, you know what I mean? It's like, I don't know how to even explain against that. How do you see the mythical creature in the whole entire Reformation? They're like unicorn, it's a rhinoceros, you know, it's pretty obvious. As you see from the excerpt of the article from Britannica, the word unicorn started to get translated differently once modern translations were published. And this is the unfortunate thing. People go to biblical scholars and say, well, what does this word mean? And they're like, oh, wild ox, you know. And so they just run with that. And that's what you see in documentation, usually after the Westcott and Hort text that they have. They're all over the place. One of the interesting things is in the Encyclopedia Britannica, if you look up the article for Trinity, it has the word Trinity, the concept of the Trinity is found nowhere in the Bible. It's like, what? And it's obviously written by Unitarians. And so obviously Unitarians would be against most of the Trinitarian readings in the King James. And so attacking the King James any way they know how, and many times even just these small, tiny details, so that years later someone can do a debate and say, well, you know, I agree with the Encyclopedia Britannica. And you'd be like, well, they're sort of Unitarians. They're against the King James. If they're Trinitarians, they probably gravitate towards the King James. So the whole controversy of the word unicorn is more of a modern form of translating that is combatant with the older method of translating. Yeah, it's basically, we've got all the evidence pointing to it being a unicorn, being related to monoceros, being related to a rhinoceros, where they've just sort of gone, we think it's a bull because we don't think rhinos run fast and we don't think that they leap. And I'll show you videos, you know, later on as we get into those sort of sections. Helg says, sounds about right. Yeah. Or it could be that your own research is refuting your own bias. That's what it sounds like from this guy. That's the thing. It's like, if I was to stay up, you know, for a few hours one night and go, okay, well, the Geneva French says this and this. It's like, see, you know, that's why I'm not getting. He's looking at the same material and going, and so their King James guys are wrong. And it's like, where are you getting this from? Everything is pointing toward the concept of a unicorn. They put in the marginal note, or rhinoceros. And this is where, like I was saying, and I sort of warned you and prepped you beforehand that many people who are critical of the King James Bible will use the marginal notes and say they're alternative readings. You know, they're very not, oh, they're synonyms, or this is just a clarification of which type of unicorn we're talking about. No, it's an alternative reading. You know, so you can choose either one. So, and probably in this case, both of these are wrong. You know, and you're just sort of left there going. So he's basically saying every reading that mentions the unicorn, rhinoceros, or monoceros is wrong in the Septuagint, wrong in the Vulgate, wrong in all the English Bibles up until 1611, or even including the 1611, the Geneva French, the Luther Bible. It's like everything. Like, I'm sure if I went through the Italian Bibles and all Portuguese Bibles and everything, like I usually do on my website, actually, I might even have it. No, I'll rabbit trail. But let's just let TurritinFan continue.
And they usually translate it, almost all of them, usually translated it as unicorn and put rhinoceros occasionally as a marginal reading in the King James Version, even more often as a marginal reading in the Geneva French, and sometimes actually as the main reading in the Douay-Rheims Bible. It's not clear to me whether Luther recognized the difference when he did his translation work in the German Bible, the German Luther Bible. So I can't speak to that. Someone who has done more research on Luther might know. I actually know a guy who would be a great resource on that, and perhaps I'll ask him and see if he has an answer. But for now, number 3, what about rhinoceros as a meaning for Reem in the Masoretic text? So I think we can lay to rest the notion that actually the King James translators meant rhinoceros. They definitely meant unicorn, and they definitely didn't mean rhinoceros.
Okay. They meant unicorn, but there's different types of unicorns. It's an umbrella term. And so one of the types of unicorn is a rhinoceros type. Okay, so it's not the beetle, it's not the mythical creature. It's a real creature called the rhino. Okay, so the Indian rhinoceros later on was called Rhinoceros unicornis. So yes, they meant unicorn, but they also meant that it was this type of creature, not a mythical creature. Clearly, they've said that in their margin. So this goes against the whole first point that TurritinFan was trying to write. And so what I might quickly do, I'll go to Wayback Machine. I'm going to check this article of TurritinFan's Wayback Machine. Okay, let's have a look. This one. That's history. Okay, so I'll go back to say 2016. Let's go back then. Okay. I'm just wondering how I can find something like a unicorn here in an older edition. Anyway, I'll look at that later. So what I'll do is I'll go through and I'll see what he's actually written on the unicorn earlier. And yeah, I'll check those issues. Okay, so I'll shut that down, or else I'm just sort of rabbit trailing, and it's pretty makes for a boring video. Let's continue.
They were wrong. They shouldn't have put unicorn. If they were thinking rhinoceros, they would have put rhinoceros. They had it as an alternative reading in one place. They didn't follow the lead of the Douay-Rheims Bible in putting it as the main text in a few places. They kept it as unicorn, which is more traditional. But they were wrong. That was not right. The unicorn is a mythical animal. It doesn't actually exist. But what about rhinoceros? Now, some people...
They were wrong. A unicorn it's just a mythical animal. It's so frustrating. It's like the whole concept of rhinoceroses being known in England has disappeared. I mean, you check this picture out, 1515. I mean, when you look at who Dürer was, let's just Google him. He was the guy who drew Erasmus. He would have been. It's like a Da Vinci type of fame that this guy had. Look at the artwork here. It's just amazing. Maximilian. I mean, famous guys of that the King James translators would know all about. People who'd studied the Reformation. This guy would have been key to even just like, I wonder what that guy looked like. Yeah, I wonder what Erasmus looked like. I wonder what any of these guys look like. And here's the rhinoceros picture down here. And I'm pretty sure that he does Rasmus's portraits as well. Yeah. Holben. Actually, that's Hans Holben. Sorry, I thought it was Dürer. I'm mistaken with that, but still a famous guy who was doing famous people, and so this guy would have been known. People, he was in contact with Raphael, Giovanni Bellini, Leonardo da Vinci. He was patronized by Emperor Maximilian I. I mean, these are key people of that era, just around the time when Luther came on the scene and all the rest of it. And so this sort of stuff would have been very well known. Anyone who would have studied the Renaissance and prided themselves in being a humanist scholar would have known his work. Okay, so let's just continue.
People will say, let's argue for the rhinoceros reading because it has one horn. And I think there's a fondness of suggesting, well, if it turns out that it really is the rhinoceros, then although people are wrong for thinking of what everybody thinks of, including the King James translators, namely this.
So everybody, including the King James translators, think of a horse like this. Everybody, including like this. So what he's doing, he's making, he's practicing chronological snobbery in a sense where it's like he's putting today's understanding of what a unicorn is, the kid's toy with a horn in the middle of a horse's head. He's putting that back onto the 1611 translators and saying that's exactly what they thought as well, which is it's an anachronism. You can't do that. You have to put yourself into the shoes of the guys in 1611. He's put himself in the shoes of all the guys in Reformation. They're all like unicorn. So Luther thought it was this. Everyone just thought it was this. Why have they got marginal notes saying rhinoceros? It's, to me, you're just proving yourself wrong. I just can't understand. Could you do a Google search of images of unicorns in the 1500s and 1600s? Yeah, and that's where you do get a mix because the mythical creature is considered a unicorn as well. And that's the thing. The rhinoceros is called a unicorn. This mythical creature is called a unicorn. So you type in unicorn and you get a mix. And so, but like I've pointed out, these things like the Karkadan that was in the Middle East, and also Middle English definitions, the rhinoceron, the unicorn, is a wild beast by kind and may be tamed by no one. So this is in 1398. There are many kinds of unicorns. Some be rhinoceron, some be monoceron, and some be eglaceron. Another beast here is that hat rhinoceros. It is more than an elephant. Its wild wood is his haunt, for on his snout and horn, and he bears that he sleep with lions and bears. And so he's in the woods. So, these are clearly talking. No one can tame this thing. It's equivalent to the rhinoceros. This is the rhinoceron, Middle English. So the translators would have known about this. This is definitions. So anyway, Treasury of Scripture Knowledge just says the Reem is most probably a rhinoceros. It's like, okay. Jamison, Fawcett, and Brown, Israel is not as they were at the Exodus, a horde of poor, feeble, spiritless people, but powerful and invincible as a Reem, that is, a rhinoceros. It's like half of the modern guys are sort of saying this as well. Anyway, let's continue.
Although the King James translators and everybody else at the time thought of this animal, at least if it's a rhinoceros, then although they got the animal wrong in their heads, the name unicorn would fit. Plus, it means that the Septuagint was right, and it means the Vulgate was right. The Vulgate has a... I see I got a comment from Will. I'm going to try to come to him, and I have no expectation that he's listening to this, so I won't prioritize his response unless he indicates that he's listening, and then I will prioritize his response. But I'll try to come to it before the end of the video if I have time. Let's see. So what about rhinoceros as a meaning for Reem in the Masoretic text? As you might infer from my comments above, I don't share the optimism of the King James translator that there were actual unicorns. But Nick and others have suggested that unicorn could be a reasonable translation because...
Notice he changed that. I do not share the optimism of the early Reformation period. But he said the King James translators. And so it's not just the early Reformation period. I don't share the optimism of the entire Reformation period and the Vulgate and the Latin and in every language. So he's only mentioned the King James, so let's continue.
The rhinoceros has one horn. It's a one-horned animal. And that is the etymological meaning of unicorn, one horn. And it also has an advantage over real unicorns in that it's not mythical or legendary. But there's several great reasons to reject the rhinoceros.
So he is refusing to acknowledge that a rhinoceros is a unicorn, that a beetle is a unicorn, that a mythical creature is also a unicorn. He doesn't have correct categories. This is a category error.
Hypothesis. The most obvious reason is that today, at least, the rhinoceros is not indigenous to the Middle East, although there's a lot of ongoing research on ancient rhino.
Okay, so we'll have to, again, disprove a notion. Okay, so if it's not indigenous to the Middle East, why was this written in the 10th, 11th century by a Persian scholar about the Karkadan? And most people are saying this is the Indian rhinoceros. Okay, so now this is copied from Wikipedia. I made this clear yesterday that I just went, oh, this is interesting, pasted it. But it has these two descriptions, leave no doubt that it's the Indian rhinoceros. Well, I'm not that sure. They've drawn a picture of it, but the horn is in the middle of its head there and not on the horn, on the nose. It's not on the forehead, but it's right in the middle. I mean, that could just be, artists back then. They could have struggled with a few bits and pieces here and there. But what about this creature? Why are you saying that the rhinoceros is not sort of native of the Middle East? Is Persia not part of the Middle East? Yeah, even Pakistan is considered part of the Middle East. And it's Middle East is quite broad, but you're talking about somewhere near Israel. Let's just jump on the map. Okay, so let's go to Iran. Here's a map. So Persia, Persia even at one stage had Baghdad as its capital. But we're looking at, here's Israel here. We're looking at these type of creatures being there. So I guess, they can't go down to this region, or they were never part of this region, or they couldn't have been found in Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Syria or Lebanon. Obviously, they're seeing these creatures, they're drawing them in 1,000 years ago. So to say that they weren't around 2,000 years ago in this region, I'm not sure where you're getting that. Let's pray for him. It seems that ego, the stumbling block of the youth. So keep all of these guys in prayer and pray that those being influenced to think that the Bible is just full of errors all the way through. And I'm reading through this, and for the life of me, I can't see. Like sometimes I can get in the feed of people and see, oh yeah, that's what they're seeing. I just can't see anything that TurritinFan's saying here about the unicorn, that the King James translators only thought it was a mythical creature. I mean, we're talking about some of the most brilliant guys in England at the time. To think that they didn't know, were they living under a rock?
So it's possible that we will find out that there were parts of the Middle East where there were rhinos.
Yep.
Today, rhinoceroses are primarily found in the grasslands and floodplains of eastern and southern Africa, with smaller versions in the swamps and rainforests of Southeast Asia. Is it conceivable that they were once in Canaan? This is speculation. Could they have been part of a zoo or another exhibit? Again, more speculation. But although we can hypothesize some, there doesn't seem to be much concrete evidence that they were a common animal in or around Israel during the time when the King James Bible, not when the King James Bible was translated. That doesn't matter. We're talking about the Old Testament word Reem.
Okay, so 1,000 years ago, the Karkadome is in Persia. I mean,
when the King James translated is totally irrelevant to that question. How about from the time of Moses until the time of Jesus? Were there?
I mean, Moses came out of Africa, so did the Israelites. I mean,
rhinoceroses in the Middle East. Well, it doesn't seem that there were any significant amount of them there, but maybe archaeology will turn some up.
Any significant amount, or there has to be a lot, or could there be? I mean, we talk about certain animals and they're nearly extinct, and we talk about things like a dodo bird, and most people know what we're talking about, or things that are extinct. Tasmanian tiger, or that's here in Australia, but we might talk about an animal and there's only 100 of them left, or a certain elephant, or certain tiger, white tiger.
But what if there were? What if it could even be possible that it could be a rhinoceros? Even if they don't have them there, surely they've heard of these animals.
So now they don't have them there. And like, seriously, this was just a quick little glance. Like, what I might do, I might type in Aurochs, Israel. And go history. Rhinos in Samaria. Here we go. So Ishati says, didn't Africans associated with the Israelites in the Old Testament? Yeah, they knew of the Ethiopians. I mean, Moses was married to an Ethiopian woman. It's like, but yeah, apparently you've got to. Okay, so they're going down in this cave and they've found these things. Now let's just type in rhinos. It's the main topic. The discovery of a rhino tooth has generated particular excitement. Okay, rhinos haven't been seen in the land of Israel in the last 20 or 30,000 years. So obviously, this is evolutionary, and certainly not this type of African rhino. Okay, so they've found an African rhino tooth in Israel. Okay. Turus, rhinoceros. Rhinoceros in the Middle East. Okay, so this is in 2011, an article. I'll just type in rhino. Hopefully no weird pop-ups come up. So a rhinoceros trampling through the town. Okay, so does it play? So it looks like a play. Okay, so that's not really helping us. Anyway, that would be an interesting thing to look at, but let's just continue to go through. So, I mean, they're obviously saying, oh, they haven't found these rhinos for 30,000 years, and so they can't really date back that far. So what they're saying is these things are found fossilized, or they've found the skeletons of rhinos in that area. But, you know, they're dating it. Obviously, I believe they're dating it wrong. But 1,000 years ago, there was people were describing rhinoceroses in Iran, so which isn't that far. And it's not far-fetched to say that one of these animals could come up from Africa, or one of these animals could come from Persia. And if they're finding these teeth in a dig, it's like, well, there we go. We've found another rhino tooth, obviously stating that they were around back then. So the whole thing of TurritinFan sort of mocking that type of concept, it's like, even if they were around there, you know, etc., that's not really working for me.
Those exotic animals from another place. So even if they just heard of them from another place, they could still talk about them. So let's consider the texts, the actual Bible verses. So
no, it's 23, 22.
Let's see. I'll take a pause right here before we turn to the scripture, the inspired, inerrant, and infallible word of God. Let's consider what Will Kenney says. And I'm sorry, it takes over half the page, but since he's provided it, I'll go ahead and respond to it now. So he says, unicorns is right. It isn't. And there are many Bibles in multiple languages that read unicorns. Well, that's true. But why in the world does Will Kenney care what many Bibles say? When many Bibles disagree with Will Kenney, all those many Bibles turn out to be wrong in Will Kenney's idea. This is
like, I understand what TurritinFan is saying here about Will Kenney, but the thing is that Will Kenney, surprisingly, if you you know, to the critical text guys, if you actually sit down and go, okay, so what are Bibles that are like the King James? And he'll rattle off a whole bunch of them from the Trinitarian Bible Society. He'll talk about Spanish Bibles that are good, that he would recommend. And so they're like, oh, no, it's only got to be the King James. And he's just pointed out the research that TurritinFan's just done. He's like, unicorns are right. And there are many Bibles in multiple languages that read unicorn. So is that a false statement? Or do we have to go, oh, no, he's a King James only. He doesn't care. He's only trying to defend the King James. Or is that a true statement and that actually backs up the King James? Yes, sometimes it's like, okay, some of these Bibles are saying the wrong thing because there's so many mistakes in other Bibles. And the thing is, if you're proclaiming that the King James has no error, of course, you come from that position where you're like, okay, well, we've got no error here. If it was a book on mathematics and you were to say, okay, well, Einstein's in agreement with us, you might mention a name of someone and say, look, they're in agreement with us too. There might be a couple of places where you're in disagreement with their science or with their mathematics, but you still are saying that they're in agreement. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the problem is, if you were to look at the ESV, there are so many errors, like in New King James, geographical errors, you know, historical errors, translational errors, so many problems with these Bibles that it just becomes tiresome to go through and see all these deletions and additions and mistranslations that you're just like, man, these are rubbish at the end of the day. And so when you look at the King James, you don't have that problem. So Will Kenney's correct here. He says unicorns is right. And there are many Bibles in multiple languages that read unicorns. It's just a pretty stock standard thing, but
what we call a pretense. This isn't the real reason why Will Kenney thinks that unicorns is right, just because many Bibles say so. When many Bibles disagree, and virtually all modern Bibles disagree with Will Kenney on this point. Almost
modern Bibles.
Every scholar today who studies this topic would disagree with Will Kenney on this point. On all the translators who are translating without a preference for sticking with the King James wording.
We'll see the whole reason that there is an underlying theme of why Will said it the way he has is because usually people are saying it's a mistake in the King James. Okay, so but what TurritinFan is basically saying here, it's a mistake in the Vulgate, it's a mistake in the Septuagint, it's a mistake in the Wycliffe, it's a mistake in the Geneva, it's a mistake in the Bishops, it's a mistake in the Great Bible, it's a mistake in the Coverdale Bible, it's a mistake in the Luther Bible, it's a mistake in the Tyndale Bible, it's a mistake in the Wycliffe Bible, it's a mistake, the French Geneva Bible, it's a mistake in this Bible, and you would just be there rattling off pretty much everything. And so Will Kinney's just gone, unicorn is right, and there are many Bibles in multiple languages that read unicorn, because he knows usually people are just saying, the King James has an error here. King James, I'm focusing on the King James, where oftentimes they have not done the research and looked at other pre-King James Bibles or other language Bibles of that era. And it has, anyway, let's continue.
Today, we're going to disagree with Will Kinney on this point. But, when it's convenient to say many Bibles in multiple languages read this way, that becomes a pretense for defending the King James Version. But in fact, it's not right. It says the King James Bible translators themselves told us what animal this is. Well, they told us what it is by using the name, and the name was unicorn. And they told us what the animal isn't by putting or rhinoceros in the margins and explaining that all marginal notes are there for when there's multiple senses that are possible.
Oh my! Oh, bro, it's just so bad. I mean, I'm gobsmacked. Okay, so the King James translators clearly said it's a rhinoceros. Okay, this is like the category. Go through a unicorn can cover many different animals, but if you want to nail it down, it's a rhinoceros type of thing. Because of the bias against the King James and the misreading of the notes, the marginal notes in the King James, TurritinFan is now made out that this is an alternative reading. That it could have been unicorn or it could be a rhinoceros. Or they're different, but they went with the unicorn, the mythical creature, the unicorn. It gives me a headache. I'm sure it gives you a headache too. It's just to me, this is amazing logic. But anyway, let's let him talk about Will.
This is the part that Will Kinney doesn't just agree with the King James translators. He thinks that the main text of the King James is correct. They thought that it's uncertain, that it could be the main text or it could be the alternative. And
so you notice it's an uncertain, it's an alternate reading. It's none of these are just something to clarify. It's always, this is just, they're sitting around going, I don't know. It could be a rhino, though, I guess. It could be a unicorn. Could be, we're going to say it's a mythical creature, or we're saying it could be a real creature. We're not sure. No, they're saying it's a unicorn. Which type of unicorn? A rhinoceros type of unicorn. Very simple. No bending over backwards to make out that the King James translators are a bunch of dimwits or they didn't know what they were doing. And so the thing is, where I'll branch from here is I'll go through and look at sermons where they're talking about these verses. Lancelot Andrews, John Boyce, Thomas Bilson, Miles Smith, and I'll look at all their writings and where they've mentioned unicorn and what they say about it. And it's going to be quite interesting to bring that up too, because he's basically saying that they were only making out that this is a mythical creature. And where he gets that from is basically, from what I can gather, is just from his bias against the King James. And now he's clinging on to the marginal notes being an alternate reading. So just, like a New King James, this is a United Bible Society reading. It's totally different. It's like, instead of saying they went into the land, they didn't go into the land, or something, like the New King James says they increased their joy or they have not increased their joy. It's one of those readings, an alternative reading that's just completely opposite, instead of a helpful reading. That's just like that, like category, putting something in its correct category. Okay. It's quite amazing, really.
In many, many places. Those double vertical lines, those are not some rare thing in the King James Bible of 1611.
Okay, so I'm going to just, because he's mentioning these double vertical lines so often, we'll go to my website, tr.org.au. We'll just have a look at some of these double lines. Okay, so if you go to my main page, if you go almost to the bottom of the page, you have internal links, marginal notes in the 1611 authorized version. So faith that worketh by love says unicorn is a creature in heaven only. No, unicorn is most probably described as a type of rhinoceros. So here we have the different types. So let's go through and we'll get the double ones. Let's find them. Oops. Didn't copy. Okay, actually, you have to go to marginal notes at the bottom here. Then it will show you every marginal note. And so this is a project that I'm doing as well as 400 other things that I'm putting exactly in what it has. So in Genesis 1, it's got the little asterisk, as in the beginning God created, and so I've got that written there. That's exactly what it says. And so eventually I'll have pictures and all the rest of it, but it's quite a big project. But let's go down to here, the double lines. So that and okay. All right, so most of this article doesn't have whether it's double-lined or not, but thankfully I do have one at the beginning. So the moving creature or the creeping creature. Now, would you say that's an alternate, or it's just describing? It's like, okay, the moving creature or creeping. The moving creature or the creeping creature that has life, or the moving creature, it's the same thing. It's just giving it a little bit more of a synonymous emphasis, an emphasis from a synonym. Now, if we are to go to Isaiah, 34, 11. Okay, so let's go down to 34:7, where it has rhinoceros here. Yeah, he mentioned that there was another double line thing. Okay, so yeah, we're going to look at some of the double line readings here. So there's one in the same one, or drunken, which was or soaked. So you're drunk, with the blood of the martyrs, or you're soaked with the blood of the martyrs. They were well drunken, the feast of the wedding at Cana, John 2, or they're well soaked. So obviously, when it's talking about people, it would have drunken in English. When it's talking about the land, it's talking about being soaked with blood, and we would probably use that same definition today. Like if you soaked your shirt, you wouldn't say the shirt drank up all the water. It's like, but it might literally say that in the Hebrew. So it's just a distinction. That's or drunken or soaked, but we're talking about land here. We're not talking about people. So when in John chapter 2 it says they're well drunk, it doesn't mean they're drunk because they're only drinking grape juice, according to me. So that'll be another video. So obviously it's defining the word. It's not. It's just an alternative word. The land's drunk and wobbling around everywhere. It's like, and even then, it's like drunken doesn't mean to be drunk with alcohol. It just means I can be drunken with apple juice, non-alcoholic apple juice. I'm well drunken. Thank you for that. So yeah, we can see the double lines there. We see here, or night monster, okay, which is I can't even read that in that. He's fellow the screech owl or night monster. And so it's defining that animal. So that would be another interesting study on animal. Let's go to somewhere where it's not talking about an animal, because animals seem to be, hard to grasp, or the cormorant or a pelican, or they have forsaken thy tacklings. Okay, so thy teachings are loosed. Okay, or they have forsaken thy tacklings. Oh, sorry, the teachings. Thy tacklings are loosed. So they've been loosed. They've been like letting loose a bunch of horses. There's been a stealing, a thievery there. So interesting. A lot of those I'd have to look up words and all the rest of it. I thought I could just come up. But I think the easiest one is soaked that he dealt with. Clearly, there's not much of a difference there. One is the land soaks it up, or one is people soak it up. Which word are you going to use? Are you going to say, hey, I drank your coffee. I'm soaked in your coffee. Or I drank your coffee. You know, obviously, there's some reason that they put that in, whether it's been an issue in earlier English editions or where the Hebrew looks at this word as drunken, and but clearly in the context it needs to be soaked because it's talking about the ground. To me, these are synonymous, and just as rhinoceros and unicorn here are synonymous as well. And so it's quite amazing. It's quite amazing how it took me 15 to 20 minutes to come to the conclusion that unicorn meant rhinoceros. I mean, I came to that conclusion, I think, in 2008. I remember, actually, I was involved with the church, and I was having lunch at a friend's house, and this guy used to always, you know, try and encourage us and help us and all the rest of it. He was sort of like a Bible study leader. And I remember him, he was talking about something, and he said, what are you studying? He used to always say, what are you studying, Nick? And I said, well, unicorns. So why are you studying that? And I said, well, because I found out that unicorn means there's a rhinoceros unicornus, which is a rhino. And he said, why are you wasting your time studying that? And I just sort of went, okay, and just went quiet. So in other words, if I was studying nothing and playing golf, you'd be happy. You know what I mean? Like, at least I'm studying. It mightn't be something that you're into. And half the time I've done the studies on, you know, salvation and, you know, Calvinism and Arminianism and, you know, eschatology and the rapture and timing. I've done all those studies. It's like you start getting into nitty gritty of everything. And the thing is, I'd be street preaching and people would come up and say, oh, the Bible says unicorns in it. And I'd say, yeah, well, the scientific name for Indian rhinoceros is Rhinoceros unicornus. Did you know that? And they'd be like, oh, I say, so it's a rhinoceros. That's what a unicorn is. And just say that straight out, like when I'm street preaching. And even atheists would just be like, yeah, okay. Well, you got a good point there, you know. And once you've made a good point like that, they're more susceptible to listen to you and go, yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about. If I was like, no, it's a wild ox, the King James guys just got it wrong, and so did Luther, and so did everyone, except for when Westcott and Hort came with his Unitarian friends, they got it all right, you know. When he's using more time and effort to be uncertain about the meaning of the word unicorn. So it takes like 15 to 20 minutes to figure it out, but then he's using more time more time and effort to be uncertain. He's to me, he's desperately searching for something that backs up what he's saying, and he's, instead of going, okay, well, I can understand Nick would go that way with this, he's just like, see, it proves my point. And I'm like, it's not really proving your point, and it's actually sort of revealing that you're being very biased in this study. And I'm not saying it to toot my own horn. I'm just saying this because it shows his bias when studying, which is not good for biblical doctrine. Absolutely. Extinct giant rhino elasmotherium. Yes. And so I think so too. It could be something like that. We're not exactly sure, but it's definitely a type of rhino. It's definitely one-horned. Okay, so let's go back to here.
He says, Francis Turretin has no inerrant Bible in any language that he can show us. Of course, he's playing word games here because, of course, I'm actually quite happy to say that we have the inerrant Word of God in Hebrew for the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament. And I've
the Greek in the New Testament, the NA28, and where he disagrees with the NA28 is in the apparatus, which opens up a whole can of worms. And so, and most of the time, I don't think that TurritinFan reads Hebrew. And so he's saying, okay, that's the Bible. Okay, so where's a good translation of that? Or where is the best translation of that? And at the end of the day, can that be corrected by the Septuagint or the Targums or the Samaritan Pentateuch? Or most of these modern Bibles do that. So that's why we're like, we don't want this corrected nonsense. We just want the words of God in English. And so the King James translators nailed it. They have the correct wording. They have the Masoretic text, Hebrew and Aramaic in English, and also the Textus Receptus. So the thing is, he's not following the TR either. So he would say the TR is filled with errors, and he would probably go through the Erasmus anecdotes and talk about 1957, how it was inserted into the text and all this sort of stuff. So just saying, I follow the Masoretic text and the Greek. He follows a totally different Greek, and only people who are sort of ignorant of this whole debate would go, oh, he follows the Greek. It's what we know. It's a different Greek. It's got 2,900 less words, and it's got 8,000 changes in it. So it's like a different book. It's like saying you're looking at Harry Potter, but when you're actually reading, what's the other one called? Lord of the Rings or something like that. Not that I look at really any of them.
held up that bound edition in our debate, in his debate with me. But he says, here's why unicorns are correct, and directs us to his brandplux.webs.com website. And you can see the full URL there. I believe I linked to his page on my own response. He adds very little to the argument, and perhaps I'll add some more responses to his, since he's taken the time to provide this comment on the video. He says, if he that has ears to hear, let him hear. But if any man be ignorant, let him be ignorant. So we'll see. He's very insistent that unicorn is correct. But let's examine what the Word of God says and compare that to what Will Kinney says. So Will Kinney says unicorns is right. And he appeals to the fact that there's many Bibles translated by men and which differ from each other in many places. But let's check what it's just bizarre to hear that kind of argument from Will Kinney, because he doesn't believe that many Bibles are right and that many Bibles in many languages are right.
Of course he doesn't believe that many Bibles are right as a whole, but he would say, he would admit, okay, that one reading, that New King James reading is probably akin to 1611, but you go to the next verse and it's a mess. Next one, oh, that's okay. Next one, oh, that's okay. Next one, oh, that's bad. Next one, that's okay. So do you want a Bible like that? Do you want a Bible with errors in it? That's why we always do these debates. Does the King James have errors? And when we go through them, these are the best arguments people have, unicorn and Easter and all this stuff. And to me, I'm just absolutely convinced. And going through this is not me trying to convince myself. I've been convinced for many years. But obviously, I'm doing this video for other people, because some other people have watched Francis Turretin, I should say TurritinFan. They've watched, because sometimes I think his name is actually Francis Turretin. They've watched TurritinFan go through this, and they're convinced that he is correct and there's mistakes and all the rest of it. And so that's why I'm meticulously going through, and just, if you're following what I'm saying, you can see he is being very biased with the information.
He doesn't believe that at all. So it's a pretext. It's for people who don't understand his actual viewpoint. But let's continue. What does the Word of God say? Numbers 23:22 and Numbers 24:8. They're very close to each other. As I mentioned above, they appear on the same page of printed text in, which was it? I think it was the Geneva Bible. The French Geneva Bible has them on the same page of text. In this context, in the context of both, Balaam has been trying to curse Israel, but has only succeeded in blessing them. In the midst of his discussion, Balaam praises God's strength as being like that of a reem, which the King James Version identifies as unicorn. It's possible that the King James translators thought that unicorn was a good fit, because the next verse says, surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. And it might be thought that this aligns well with late medieval conceptions of the unicorn as a magical creature.
So anything that has to do with a type of magical thing, when people boil the rhino horn for medicinal purposes, or that can't be the same as a unicorn having a horn with medicinal purposes. Now, I understand that's also in the myths as well, but people really do shoot these rhinos and steal their horns and thinking that they're going to get cured of certain diseases. If you were ignorant of modern day medicine and you had some sort of disease, you would probably go out and shoot a rhino yourself and boil its horn and eat it, just in case that would cure you. At least you're going to live. And anything to do with magic or myth or whatever, he's just like, see, they're talking about this other unicorn. So he's just grasping at anything. And so he's saying in the context here, it's talking about, there's no divination against Israel and all this. Oh, well, that's talking about the mythical unicorn. Just reading it, that's not proper exegesis. This is eisegesis here. This is classic eisegesis. This is squeezing into the text something that's simply not there.
Remember what the great Reformed scholar has said about the unicorn's horns removing the poison that the dragon puts in the water. That the dragon has this negative influence and the unicorn has a positive influence in that way of looking at things.
Okay, so that's talking about the mythical unicorn. So I guess someone mentioned about a mythical unicorn. So I guess, to me, it's just like if a King James guy said someone was in gay clothing and someone was insisting, no, they actually meant they were dressed up like they were going to go to the Mardi Gras or go night clubbing or whatever. It's like, no, that's not what they meant. And then me just going through all the information, and it's all basically talking about gay meaning bride or happy or all those definitions, and going, well, everyone sort of agrees with the bright and happy and all that. They're not saying it's anything to do with someone's sexuality, but it still is. And it's just sort of like that you're floating with no evidence here. There's just absolutely nothing that you're going on. So anyway, we'll continue through this. We'll see what his argumentation is.
On the contrary, though, instead of the much better contextual clue is that God brought them out from Egypt. The image that the scriptures are providing is of God pulling them out using his great strength, the way that oxen pull heavy carts. There is a lot of oxen, bull, cattle imagery in the context. In Numbers 22:4, Moab said to Midian that they were worried about the Israelites wiping out the nations as the ox licks up the grass of the field. Numbers 22:4. This is significant. We're going to come back to this point. Balak offered oxen and sheep as an initial sacrifice, and then demanded 7 oxen and 7 rams to be sacrificed, and then again at a different place, and then again a third time.
Okay, so the Israelites, they had a lot of cattle. It's pretty clear that's most of the sacrifices with the Israelites were to do with cattle. People in the land, they had cattle. And there are separate Hebrew words for a cow, for a bull, for different types of cattle. Reem has been translated as a one-horned animal. The monoceros in the Septuagint, the unicorn in the Latin. There's really been nothing that suggests that this is a bull or a cow or anything like that up until modern times. So I guess everyone's had it wrong. Absolutely, all the ancients had it wrong. Everyone's had it wrong. And then Westcott and Hawke came on the scene, and they're like, see, these guys are just simply wrong. It's a cow. Okay, so the good thing is we have 9 verses where we can identify what this animal is, and we can see if it is actually a cow. Let's check it out.
Furthermore, in the second instance of Balaam praising God as having the strength of a reem, he adds, he shall eat up the nations, his enemies, and he shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. Notice the similarity to the worry that Israel would eat up the nations like an ox. Moreover, the term translated arrows, while it usually does have that sense, is basically a term for a thing that pierces. Of course, that's why arrows are usually the meaning. But it could also refer to horns. In this case, even if it usually means arrows, we can extend Balaam a little poetic license because he's saying what literally translates to, with his piercers, pierce, if we're going to use a very woodenly literal translation. He's saying that he says pierce them through with his arrows, but more literally, with his piercers, pierce. It's just these two Hebrew words, wahisa, yemhas. You can kind of hear the similarity, the hus comes through in both. With his piercers, pierce. Sorry, you can see better, maybe you can't. With his yemhas, which is also, doesn't highlight properly, but it goes from right to left, of course. The very next sentence compares God or the people to a lion, just as Numbers 23:24 did. And recall also that the image of God that was made by the Israelites when they were coming out of Egypt was a molten calf made from gold. And recall that the altars of the tabernacle of the Lord had horns, which were coated with blood, as you can see in many passages, and were used to tie the sacrifice to the altar. Similar horns are described in the altar in Ezekiel 43, as well as the altar at Bethel. While representations of God as a bull or the like were prohibited by the second commandment, the analogy or metaphor is there. In this context, an animal such as a wild ox, for example, the Aurochs, and there's a link here to some more discussion about the Aurochs, fits the description very well. Volume 14 of the Syrian dictionary, and here's a link, describes the Rima or as a wild bull. It might be Rima, might be Rima. I don't know the exact pronunciation. My Assyrian is, if anything, worse than my Hebrew. They're both not worth it.
So now we're going to the Assyrian and saying, okay, well, that's because it's a wild bull, that's the same as Reem, okay?
Describing as positive. These were...
And the thing is, too, this is a dictionary definition. This is what I find with people talking about the different languages. We're talking about Assyrian or we're talking about the Ugaritic. Many times they're like, well, this word means this. And you look it up and it's just a dictionary definition. So someone who is influenced by modern translations goes, oh, well, a reem is a wild bull. And that's it. And how about we're shown not just an Assyrian dictionary definition, a modern one, but we're shown Assyrian writings translated and we look at the usage. So that's where you usually find that these have a modern bias. And that's half the time what you're dealing with when people say, oh, the Ugaritic say this. It's like, yeah, modern day people who believe that the Bible has errors in it and they're trying to match it up with the revised version or something else, they would define it like that. But anyone, if you were to get this language and bring it back to the King James translators, they would define it very differently. And so, Shati says, how so is he even trying to argue what is a correct translation if he doesn't even know the language himself? And yeah, that's the thing. Look, I've got no problem with laity sort of looking at scholarship and going, okay, this is what I think it is, and all the rest of it. But I'm going to go through this. We'll look at it in the King James, and I think we'll see, and we'll have a look and see if there's any other marginal notes or any other helps. We'll look at the so-called parallels of the bulls and all the rest of it. Because the thing is, most of the time when you see these cows and the bulls, it's making a clear distinction that this is a reem. So why wouldn't it say, if it's talking about an ox, okay, or a cow or whatever, why would it talk about cows and then talk about something completely different and then talk about cows again? Obviously, this is something distinct. But he's saying, oh, because they're in the same context, they must be the same. So if it had lions around here, so we're probably talking about a lion. No, it's talking about something distinct. And so even at times it talks in some of these references to where a unicorn appears, it's talking about it will come down with the bulls. And it's like, Yeah, so it's coming down. It's like saying the birds came down with the elephants. It's like it doesn't mean there that a bird is an elephant. It's just this type of reasoning is it's unreasonable. But let's let him finish this section, and then we're going to go back and we're going to look at numbers. And I think we'll look at some of the commentaries and we'll go through all that.
Apparently sufficiently impressive animals that Assyrian kings bragged about hunting them, and apparently described the animal as having an uplifted head and being of some kind of similar danger to a lion.
Okay, so I can't find where he's reading there. Oh, a lion. So, but this is from a dictionary. Okay. I'm not saying that this is correct or incorrect. You just got to be careful where they haven't got usage. Statues
were apparently made of them in silver and copper by the Assyrians, and you can read that entry. There's multiple pages that the entry provides, if you'd like. There, it's a PDF document. I didn't copy it in here because they put some copy protections on the PDF, and I'm trying to be respectful of that. Obviously, the similarity of sound between Reem and Rima might be a persuasive argument that it could be the same animal, although by itself, that similarity of sound should only carry a small weight. But considering the first two verses, namely Numbers 23:22 and Numbers 24:8, God brought them out of Egypt. He has, as it were, the strength of a unicorn, and God brought him forth out of Egypt. He has, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. He shall eat up the nations, his enemies, and shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. We can conclude from these that although rhinos can't be ruled out absolutely by this verse, they don't seem like the most likely animal for Balaam to mention in context. Instead, an aurochs or other wild bull or wild ox is a better fit.
Why? It doesn't seem to fit the context. These other ones do. Okay, why? Let's have a look.
Both because they fit the reference back to an ox eating the nations like grass, and because arrows better fits with multiple horns of a wild ox than with the single horn of a one-horned rhinoceros.
Okay, so I'll just go back a tiny bit just so I can get the reference. Numbers 23:22. Let's have a look at that. Okay. Textus Receptus Bibles. Okay, so I like to go to my own page here and then go to that site. So it helps me. If I'm going through this site, 300 times in a day and studying, I'll do this because I think Google will say, oh, they're going to this site because my site used to be first, and then a friend of mine made this site, and now this comes up first because he's a very good web designer. And I'm like, but it's okay. We're friends. But he does put the KJV 2016 on his site, and he does have a whole separate page for that, which is really cool. And I've helped with some of the information on this website. So what are we looking at? So let's go to Numbers. (23). Now, goldfish me. (23), 22, and 24:8. Okay. So, oops, where are we? 22. So God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of an unicorn. So, even Jay Green's gone with wild ox. Buffalo, Julie Smith. Young just has Reem. Okay, transliterates it. Unicorn. So we know what they all say. They always say unicorn. And that is the word there. The Reem, the Resh, the Aleph, and the name. Okay, so here it has unicorno in the Reina Valera. So let's go to a parallel instead. So we'll have the King James open. Actually, if we at verse 22, it shouldn't really matter. We should be able to recognize it. Yeah, 22. So let's go to, say, well, what are we actually doing? Yeah, we're reading it in context. So maybe what I should do as well, I'll go to Numbers 23. I'll type in 16:11. And we'll just look at the 16:11 as well. Okay, so it's 23, 22 right there. Okay, so let's just read this. And he took up his parable and said, Rise up, Balak, and hear, hearken unto me, thou son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, neither a son of man that he should repent. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, and shall it not be made good? Shall he not make it good? Behold, I have received commandment to bless, and he hath blessed, and I cannot reverse it. He hath not beheld iniquity in Jacob, neither hath he seen perverseness in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the shout of a king is among them. God hath brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of an unicorn. And so, wouldn't that fit the context? He's come out of Egypt. Perhaps it's a place where there's a ton of unicorns, rhinoceroses there. Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. That's definitely not talking about the mythical creature. That's making me absolutely cringe. According to this time, it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought? Behold, the people shall rise up as a great lion, and lift up himself as a young lion. He shall not lie down until he eat of the prey and drink of the blood of the slain. So yeah, it's pretty clear. So he's just as much as he's reading into that, there's no enchantment against Jacob, there's no divination against Israel. I could say, okay, this is relating to a lion-like creature. The young lions mentioned here. It's just that's not really good scholarship. But let's look at some other places. So let's go to, I think it's the next chapter, in verse 8. So we'll go there. Okay, so verse 8 has a God, unicorn. Here we are. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. So this is relating back to chapter 23, 22. So let's go to 24 here. I might just throw a different Bible up there, so bishops. Let's go to chapter 24 and verse 8. Okay, so we'll start say it verse. Okay, and Balaam, verse 2, and Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel abiding in his tents according to their tribes. And the Spirit of God came upon him, and he took up his parable and said, Balaam, the son of Beor, hath said, and the man whose eyes are open hath said. He hath said, which heard the words of God, which saw the vision of the Almighty, falling into a trance, but having his eyes open. How godly are thy tents, O Jacob, and thy tabernacles, O Israel, and the valleys are they spread forth as gardens by the riverside, as the trees of line, aloes, which the Lord hath planted, and as his cedar trees beside the waters. He shall pour the water out of his buckets and his seed shall be in many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brought him forth out of Egypt. He hath as it were the strength of an unicorn. He shall eat up the nations, his enemies, and shall break their bones, and shall pierce them through with his arrows. And so it doesn't say horns here. Okay, so that would be an interesting thing, because he was sort of saying this is allegorical of a cow, having two arrows. So it's in plural. But he's saying he will eat up the nations, his enemies, and shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. And so let's look at that. 24:8. Numbers 24:8. Bible Hub. Okay, so let's go to the Hebrew. Make it bigger. Okay, with his arrows. So he's saying he will consume the nations. So he's going to eat all the nations. So obviously this is talking in a figurative type of sense. His enemies and their bones he shall break. And with his arrows shall pierce them. Now, he couched and he lays down as a lion. So it's obviously that whole lion thing is not talking about an ox or anything. He's saying he's got the strength of a unicorn. He's going to eat nations. He's going to break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. It doesn't mean that it's talking about a cow, because it says he couched and he laid down as a lion. I mean, is a cow laying down like a lion? There's a great lion. Who shall stir him up? Blessed is he that blesseth thee, and cursed is he that. He's talking about a whole range of different objects and animals, and it's not. Here he's talking about certain plants. He talked about the line aloes, which the Lord has planted, the cedar trees. He's talking about trees. He's talking about a whole bunch of different things. But because arrows, it's horns, spiky things, and it's plural, it must mean it's a auroch. Or so let's go to the usage. Piercing through with arrows. Let's have a look at how this is used. Okay, it has archer, arrows. Arrows, make my arrows drunk. Archer, spear beam. He sent out his arrows, bow and arrows. So he's clearly talking about arrows, like a full bend back shooting an arrow. A horn is not something that flies off the animal. I don't even think that this would even be relating to a cow. This is talking about an arrow being shot. It's like a bullet. Shooting of arrows, the Almighty. Their tongue, it's like an arrow, and all this sort of stuff. Perhaps it's just talking about an arrow. Fancy that. It's just talking about an arrow. Okay, we can probably leave that there, but I don't want to just say that this is a nonsense thing that he's come up with. So I want to check with bull. Ox. Cow. What else would there be? Buffalo. Would be what's the word for kind? Any sort of usage with an arrow meaning a horn. Okay, so what is it? Jets. It just means an arrow. Okay, Okay, now I'm just going to check this word in the online Bible, which is a great resource. If you don't have it, I recommend people get it. It's really good for searching for words, Strong's numbers, etc. So it's a little bit old school. Let's search for, the Hebrew ones always have a 0 in front of it. So that's the archers. So there we have the unicorn one. So he's piercing through with arrows, a staff, arrows. They're not talking about cows' horns at all. Whose teeth and spears and arrows, and their tongue is a sharp sword. So it's obviously these are distinct things. I think to read into that it's talking about the horns of a cow is very stretched. And so I'm going to leave that there. I'm not finding anything. Now, let's not give up. Let's jump into, say, we'll go back to numbers. We'll go to the commentaries, and I'll do a few searches there. Okay, so the commentaries. Now let's type in ox. Nowhere. Let's type in horn. Nowhere. Let's type in bull. Nowhere. Let's type in what would be the word? Let's just have a quick look and look at the arrows thing, because is this a theme that someone else has thought of before TurritinFan came up with it? To smite them through with arrows, literally, as for his arrows he shall smite. His arrows should perhaps be either his oppressors or his loins. Okay, so not really helpful there. Pulpit commentary. Piercing through the arrows or dash in pieces his arrows. His arrow shot at him. The difficulty of the possessive suffix to arrows, which is in the singular. Otherwise, this rendering gives a much better sense and more in keeping with the rest of the passage. The image of Balaam's mind is evidently that a terrible wild beast devouring his enemies, stamping them underfoot and dashing them in pieces. In his fury, the arrows or darts which they vainly launch against him compare the imagery of Daniel 7. Okay, so he's sort of talking a little bit about that. Okay, pulpit commentary. Matthew Henry's. Okay, maybe I'll go arrows. Easy to see them, to slay them utterly. Geneva Bible, and pierce them through with his arrows. Okay, we looked at that, and we looked at pulpit commentary. Okay. Crush their bones and dash them in pieces with his arrows. He has encamped. He lies down like a lion. Okay. Dash them in pieces does not apply to arrows, which may be broken in pieces, but not dashed to pieces. Arrows are signaled out by representing weapons in general. Okay. So I'm just, I'm not seeing it. I'm trying to see it. I'm trying to find it. I mean, I can sort of go, okay, it's a vague sort of thing that you could say, but then it's straight away it's talking about a lion. It was talking about a cedar tree. Couldn't this just be talking about arrows? Actual, literal arrows? Rick Frias, the Anointed Prince, says, don't fall into the who can ask the best question. Friend, okay, there is an end of all truth. Keep going strong. So Helg says, From the 9 occurrences of unicorn, it sounds like its horn is something massive, also that the animal is a massive one. This makes sense if its horn is huge, combined with its strength. Rick Fry says, do a spiritual fast with what you're studying, okay? Try, you'll be amazed. Okay, thanks for the advice. So, yeah, he's saying we can conclude that although rhinos cannot be ruled out absolutely, so he's saying you can't rule out rhinos here. They do not seem the most likely animal for Balaam to mention in the context. So Balaam's just, he knows what Balaam was thinking. Yeah, they've come out of Egypt. Isn't that a place, coming out of Africa, a place where, rhinos, they've come out like a rhino. So what's this animal doing here? Instead of the aurochs or the wild bulls is a better fit, because it fits a reference back to an ox eating the nations like grass, and because arrows better fits the multiple horns. So he's saying these arrows are horns, okay, which doesn't seem like anyone else has really made that. Pulpit commentary seems to be the only thing that has anything even mentioning that, where it says, stamping them underfoot and dashing to pieces in his fury the arrows or darts, which they vainly launch against him. Okay, so he's actually talking about a different concept that some read it, not pierce them through with arrows, but that it's actually it's sort of saying that any arrow that comes against him, he will crush, sort of thing. So I wonder how that sort of fits. Brought him out of Egypt, he hath as it were the strength of the unicorn, he shall eat up the nations, and shall break their bones, and pierce them through with his arrows. Sort of like, okay, I get what they're saying. They're saying it pierce, let's say this was a rhinoceros or a cow, or whatever. They shall break their bones. So the cow or the rhino is turning around, breaking them, and then piercing them through, and they've got their arrows there, but they're no help to them, sort of thing. That's what the pulpit commentary is sort of alluding to, which seems completely different to everything else. But then it's talking about a lion crouching down. So you've got a whole bunch of different types of terminologies there. So interesting study, but I think we'll move on from there. A cow or an ox does not make sense. Yeah, they came up with a cow. Wow, I mean, we've seen a million of those before. They came up with this rhinoceros, which is like second to an elephant. And it's gonna, if you see it coming, you can't even outrun this thing. It's gonna kill you. It thinks you're gonna rob its children, and you've got arrows, and it's like it's not even gonna work. And interesting. So we'll have to go back through that someday, but not now. We want to continue. So I've already gone for 3 hours and 13 minutes. So I'll probably just go for maybe another 10, 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to pull out.
Although rhinos can't be ruled out absolutely by this verse, they don't seem like the most likely animal for Balaam to mention in context. Instead, an aurochs or other wild bull or wild ox is a better fit, both because they fit the reference back to an ox eating the nations like grass, and because arrows better fits with multiple horns of a wild ox than with the single horn of a one-horned rhinoceros. Deuteronomy 33:17. It's the second of the groups of verses. I divided them up into groups. A couple of them are two. Most of them are just one verse. When we come to Deuteronomy 33:17, the meaning of Reem becomes more clear. Here it says, his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. This is the King James Version. With them he shall push the people towards the end, together to the ends of the earth. And they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. Notice that in this context, we're dealing with the blessing of Joseph by Moses. It's found at Deuteronomy 33:13-17. And now I've graphically broken it down for you on the web page. It won't all show up on the screen at the same time and be readable. I'm going to see if I can move. I'm just going to remove my video from the screen so you can have a slightly better view. Here we go. So it says, and of Joseph he said, blessed of the Lord be his land, for the precious things of heaven, for the dew and for the deep that he coucheth beneath, and for the precious fruit brought forth from the sun, and for the precious things brought forth by the moon, and for the chief things of the ancient mountains, and for the precious things of the lasting hills, for the precious things of the earth and the fullness thereof, and for the good will of him that dwelt in the bush. Let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph, and upon the head, top of the head of him that was separated from his brethren. So it's, let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph, and on the top of the head of him that was separated from his brethren. Remember, Joseph was separated from his brothers. His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. Notice the use of repeated poetic parallels throughout this passage. You can see them. I've used the bold and italics on the screen to show them. You can see that there's the heaven and the deep, the precious things of the heaven, as well as the deep that couches beneath. The precious fruits from the sun, the precious things brought forth by the moon, the chief things in the ancient mountains, the precious things of the lasting hills, the precious things of the earth and fullness thereof. We saw that discussed in another verse. For the good will of him that dwelt in the bush. Let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph, upon the top of the head of him that was separated from his brethren. Him that was separated from his brethren, clearly this means Joseph. And the top of the head versus the head, no significant difference, just a poetically varied wording. So when we come to this next parallel, his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. We can see this word that's being translated unicorns is something quite similar to a bullock, which of course better fits a wild ox or aurochs and not a rhinoceros. On top of which, and here is one of the key things. Well, before I come to the key thing, I just note in passing that the glory is said to come onto Joseph's head. But it says that his glory, it says his glory, and it says the blessings on top of his head. The idea, as you know, glory is often associated with the head. You can see that in 1 Corinthians 11. And also laying on hands on the head of the person is associated with blessing. The gift being provided to Joseph here are horns that are used kind of to push together to the ends of the earth, meaning that they have this kind of bull-like horns on their head that they can use as an aggressive weapon. Now, and that's what bulls do, they push. You can see that in, well, you can see it in a variety of places. You can see it similarly, by way of analogy, you can see it in 1 Kings 22 or 2 Chronicles 18. And you can also see something similar in Micah 4:13. I'm trying to remember if I quote the part which talks about the bull pushing, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So what I want to emphasize here is this phrase bullock is parallel to the Reem, and there's a problem in the King James Version that obscures the matter. It's a defect. And the defect is, it says unicorns here, plural, but the Hebrew is singular. It's unicorn. If the word is unicorn at all, it should be unicorn singular. So why did they make it plural? Well, the French Geneva Bible and the Douay-Rheims Bible didn't make that mistake. They kept it singular as to match the Hebrew. And in fact, the Septuagint have singular. The Vulgate is ambiguous because the Vulgate word in Latin is the same whether it's singular or plural. So it's open, but should be singular. The Hebrew is singular here. It's not ambiguous in Hebrew. And that means the horns of a Reem, which means the Reem has more than one horn. This is why people today don't say that unicorn is right, because Deuteronomy 33:17 is the word of God, and it's infallible. It's inspired, it's inerrant, and no, the Reem has more than one horn.
So this is his, beside going through, the marginal notes and sort of, and the linguistic gymnastics that we've seen, this is one of the issues. And so in the KJV Today article is cleared up. So I'll just grab that, throw it up here. And so we clearly saw that what was brought out by the author of the KJV Today site is that sometimes you have singular words. The Hebrew for cow, bear, lion, and ox here, it's translated as the cow and the bear shall feed, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. So they're all singular nouns. However, the NCV has cows and bears will eat together in peace. Lions will eat hay as the oxen do. CEV has cows and bears will share the same pasture. Lion and oxen will both eat straw. And so they become plural nouns. And so what's the issue here? Their translations of the singular nouns in Isaiah, this is in Isaiah 11:7, probably conveyed the correct sense that pluralities are implied. Anybody can see that when the KJV says the lion shall eat straw, the passage is not speaking of a single lion, but of the entire species. And so obviously this is talking about the, when the KJV translates the singular Reem as plural unicorns in Deuteronomy 33:17, is neither wrong nor dishonest. The Reem in Deuteronomy 33:17 is clearly a generic reference to the species and not to any specific single creature. So it's just like, like I said before, the lion is a very ferocious animal. And so that could also be lions are very ferocious animals. And so here it has the horns of the unicorn, singular. We're talking about the species there. It's like saying the teeth of the lion. So I'm talking about one lion. It's talking about every lion has these type of teeth. So, that just explains that very clearly. And so the whole argumentation here that TurritinFan has brought up, he's brought up the arrows thing, which I can't really gel with. And then he's brought up this whole thing of, this is a mistranslation. So Isheti says Easton's dictionary gives a bunch of definitions. Yeah, I've got that on my website there. Hey, Nick, if you haven't already, could you do a video presentation on monogenes? Yeah, I'd love to do that. That'll be something in the future. Sometimes I'm sort of just putting out fires. You do a debate and you sort of got to go with the things that they talk about, even though these, for us guys, we're just like, it's clearly a unicorn, but for some others, they can't see it, or they've watched TurritinFan's video and they're like, wow, he says it's correct. And so so he's going like a lexical definition might have a singular word. We see this in Matthew chapter 10 verse 10, where it says a staff, when clearly the King James has staves. So but it's singular there, the rabdon. Rabdon, it doesn't say rabdos. I know Scrivener's actually changed that to rabdos, but I think it's unnecessary. But it's like if I said don't bring a mobile phone, I'm talking to 500 people. I mentioned this in the debate. It becomes plural in the context because phone is a generic word. Unicorns here it's generic. Reem is generic here, so it becomes unicorns in English. So, but he's also saying, I'll just go back a tiny bit. So he's saying that these things are synonymous. These are synonyms because they line up with each other. Joseph, upon the head of Joseph and upon the head of him that was separated from his brethren. So they're synonyms. So these have to be synonyms. The glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. And so let's just go back and we'll see this is a pattern all the way through that. Blessed be the Lord. Okay, so it's talking about heaven and the deep. So that's contrast. Heaven and the deep they're not. You wouldn't say I'm going to the deep, and people go, "Oh, well, heaven." No, you probably think you're going to hell. The sun and the moon is chalk and cheese. Ancient mountains and lasting hills, they're synonymous. Okay, the chief things of ancient mountains and the precious things of lasting hills. Okay, similar. Precious things of the earth thereof, and for the goodwill of him who dwelt in the bush. Okay, so precious things of the earth and those who dwell in the forest or the bush. But the blessing can't. So then it has Joseph. He was separated from his brethren. And then it has, which is the same. Then it has bullock and unicorn, which like I was showing before, the sun and moon. So it's not a consistent pattern. If it was consistent, it had the sun, the moon, this and that, this, and then it had a similarity. It had, just talking about synonymous things all the way through, and then this was a synonym. I'd go, wow, that's good. This doesn't fit here. And so, but clearly, he's also made the claim that this is plural, and it should be unicorn singular here. Now, if he understands that it's talking about the kind, so Helg says maybe the meaning is the horns of the unicorn kind. Absolutely, that's exactly what it means. So let's continue on.
The gift being provided to Joseph here are horns that are used to push together to the ends of the earth, meaning that they're, if the word is unicorn at all, it should be unicorn singular. So why did they make it plural? Well, the French Geneva Bible and the Douay-Rheims Bible didn't make that mistake. They kept it singular as to match the Hebrew. And in fact, the Septuagint have singular.
Well, in some languages, a singular would fit because now I'll just go back to my page, which is around here somewhere. Yeah, in some languages, you can have singular or plural, and it's just depending on the context. So, okay, here we are. So we're looking at Iran. So Deuteronomy 33:17 has horns of a unicorn. Okay, as the horns of a unicorn, horns of a unicorn, horns of a unicorn, horns of a unicorn, horns of a unicorn. Here it has the horns of unicorns. But notice the "an" is taken away. So, and his horns are as the horns of an unicorn. So that is like when it's got the "and" there, obviously saying of the species of the unicorn. So even that's clear in the Geneva and Bishops, etc. But it's abundantly clear in the King James. And his horns are like the horns of unicorns, a type that's the species of unicorns. So it's not saying that there's plural horns here. So it's talking about generally, if you're talking about there's 1 million unicorns on the planet or 500 unicorns on the planet, his horns are as the horns of unicorns. So it's like saying he's like, remember the old Nokia phone? It used to have a little aerial. You used to pull it out, or the Motorola one, you pull the aerial out. His aerials are like the aerials of Motorola. So it's obviously it's in plural, even though it's singular because it's talking about the whole species there. Pretty clear. To me, that just makes abundant sense. So let's let Turritin. So his first 2 verses, he's saying that the arrows are horns. I can't see that. He's saying that this shouldn't be pluralized. I can't see that at all. He's saying there's a type of parallelism when it's talking about the sun, the moon, etc. And I can't see that because the sun and the moon are very different, and that's in the same context. So, if anything, it's saying that they're different. The bullock and the rhino are very different. Okay.
The Vulgate is ambiguous because the Vulgate word in Latin is the same whether it's singular or plural. So it's open, but should be singular. The Hebrew is singular here. It's not ambiguous in Hebrew. And that means the horns of a reem, which means the reem has more than one horn. This is why people today don't say that unicorn is right, because Deuteronomy 33:17 is the word of God, and it's infallible, it's inspired, it's inerrant, and no, the reem has more than one horn. That's how we know that Will Kinney is wrong.
So this is for like the rest of the video, he keeps defaulting back to this type of thing. And so, I mean, clearly we can see that it's talking about the species of animal, where he's saying no, it's talking about a singular one, and these are the horns, so it's got double horns, so it's a wild ox. So this could be the place where, say, Westcott and Hort. So what I find is a lot of people involved with Bible translation, a lot of people involved with modern versions don't know the Bible that well. And so you'll mention things in the Bible and say, well, what about this and what about that? And that they don't know it. I'm not saying this about TurritinFan, but I'm just saying as a general thing, when I'm talking to people, I expect them to sort of know some of the basics, and they won't know them. And I'm like, why don't they know that? Or many times they won't see that some way that they're translating something in the New Testament totally contradicts the Old Testament, but they don't know it. They've never even looked at it. And I'm like, don't you read the Bible regularly and just go through it? And this is how you understand that the Bible is completely cohesive, that it doesn't contradict itself. So Ashati says the key words in that sentence are people today. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's been a misrepresentation of the true words of God. And just to shake this, it's like, to me, I mean, Westcott and Hort is so lame. It's like Oprah Winfrey just coming and saying, all men are horrible. And so you're just sort of trying to disprove that, If they had just never come on the scene, the world would be a much better place. With not only their fake texts, but their horrible definitions that they've put on the world, and critical text people feel obligated to defend this because of all these really poor Bible translations that have come out. But I mean, clearly, if you're following through with my previous video and this video, you can see unicorn with the caveat that they put in the margin, or rhinoceros. That it's clearly talking about some sort of rhinoceros type of a one-horned beast.
That's why it's fairly straightforward. It's just that the King James conceals it by mistranslating a singular as a plural here.
So not only have they got, so this is where it just, you can't help it but go, okay, they got it wrong there, and to prove they got it wrong there, we have to prove that they got it wrong here, and then because they got it wrong there. So I guess any time when it's talking about something plural like horns, and it uses a singular, so it's like the teeth of lions, but if it's singular lion, we've got it's a mistranslation. So this is the mentality of people critical of the King James Bible, and this is why there's so many Bible translations out there, because it's people who don't know their language as well, and because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you can apply it to unicorns, why can't you apply it to lions, to bears, to everything else mentioned in the Bible? That sometimes it's got a singular. We'll be talking about the hands of something, or the feet of something, and it's singular, but they'd make it plural because it's talking about a generalized kind or a species. Helgi says, again and again, the good sense of the KJV translators is confirmed, and TurritinFan has been effectively refuted and debunked in this stream. Yeah, and that's why I wanted to slowly go through all this. I didn't want to sort of just be back and forward and just looking at things lightly, because at first it sounds like a good argument. Oh, it's a singular word and it's translated plural. We went through this in the debate where heaven is translated singular in Genesis 1:1 because the context. Later on, there's another heaven that's involved. So then later on, when it has exactly the same Hebrew, the Hashemayim in the Hebrew is translated as heavens, plural, because of the context. And so it's very synonymous, like a man being a singular word, but really meaning plural, like mankind. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly, yeah. Or man, many human beings. That's exactly right. And that's what it's saying here, which now TurritinFan said that he couldn't open the KJV Today website. So, yeah, he hasn't read that. I think if he read that, he would be more careful in this video, but he didn't. And so he's saying this is an absolute error. And to me, this article has probably been on the internet for 10 years now. I'm sure Will Kinney probably brings up the same type of thing in his documentation. And so it's really a nothing burger. There's just nothing in it, but he will continually go back to this now as an anchor for, King James has been wrong. It's plural horns, and it's wild ox there. It's just a singular,
The best and easiest resolution is to recognize that the reem is not a unicorn or any kind of one-horned animal. Instead, it's a horned animal with at least 2 horns, such as the wild ox or aurochs. Job 39, 9 and 10 provides another couplet in which to consider reem. In Job 39, God speaks of wild goats and hinds in verses 1 through 4, wild asses in 4 through 8, reems in 9 through 12, peacocks and ostriches in 13 through 18, horses in 19 through 25, hawks at verse 26, eagles at 27 through 30. He speaks to the Job from the whirlwind, which begins at Job 38:1 and transitions from comments about the weather to fauna at verse 39 of chapter 38, where he talks about lions, and then mentions ravens before starting chapter 39. So we have lions, ravens, wild goats and hinds, wild asses, reems, peacocks and ostriches, horses, hawks, and eagles. All of these are fairly common animals from the Middle East at the time. None of these are particularly exotic. Perhaps ostriches and peacocks are a little bit exotic, but not that exotic. And they are all common animals. Now, a rhinoceros would stand out as being not typically from the Middle East, but...
So notice again, he's ignorant of Middle Eastern rhinoceroses that have been found. Now, obviously, if he's going to look up, where rhinoceroses are, they'll say they're 30,000 years old or whatever. But they were there. Africa is pretty close. There are rhinoceroses there. Persia is not that far away. 1,000 years ago, they've seen these rhinoceroses there too. So it's to say that this is a rare thing. How does he know that? He's just sort of reading back. He's got this imagery that of what he thinks Israel was like at that time, and he's saying this is a rare thing because he thinks that there's really nothing that is definitive to make us think along with him, except for it's coming from his imagination. So it's strange how TurritinFan is categorically claiming that there is an error in the KJV instead of leaving it open for discussion and evaluation. Yeah, I think he just hasn't heard the other side of that. I think if he read, because see, what I've noticed is there are some things that I've got on my website, and he's careful to say things against it because it's like, okay. But then there are other things he doesn't seem to care about. But I've in watching his videos, I know that he didn't go through the whole Oxford English Dictionary definition. So that's why he missed the multitude of things that talk about rhinoceros and things like that. Anyway, let's continue. But yeah, it is. He should be saying, "Oh, let's think about this." He's like, "No, they've made a mistake," and so he's defaulting to the King James guys just making mistakes. This is a normal critical approach to the King James, where I usually give them the benefit of the doubt. When they're world-leading experts, I go, "Hang on, it's like just turning up to Einstein's class and he's writing on the blackboard, and it's just like, you made a mistake." It's like everyone will just look at you and go, "Hang on, let him finish." I'll let him explain. Like, just to accuse these guys of making such mistakes like this, it's quite fantastical. But let's continue. I think I'll pull the pin after this one.
What if we said it was from the Middle East? Certainly it's not a rare mythical animal here. These are common real animals. So it's definitely not a unicorn.
Also, why do these have to be common? He's got wild asses, reams, peacocks and ostriches, horses, hawks, eagles. Why do they have to be? Were peacocks just backyard birds, or did you have to go looking for them? I mean, we have a lot of peacocks here in Australia, but you might stumble across them, but usually they hang around sort of car parks and where they can get fed in tourist destinations. Now, I'm sure there are a lot just out in the forest, but I don't think I've seen them in the wild for like 20 years. A peacock or an ostrich. You just say, oh yeah, there's an ostrich just standing there in the Middle East. Okay, and he's just this whole thing of they have to be common, but why do they have to be common? Why can't God talk about whatever he wants? Why can't he talk about a whale? There's only 5 of them left, or a behemoth, or a leviathan, or he can talk about whatever he wants. So where's this commonality here? I'm just not seeing that it has to be like that. So it's just sort of like, oh, these are common, this one's uncommon. So it should be an ox. That's not good argumentation.
But what about a rhinoceros? Well, with this discussion on final, God asks Job to explain how goats and hinds give birth, which of course Job doesn't know. They're the wild animals. How do the wild animals give birth? They don't have a farmer there to help them give birth. How do they do it? God points out the freedom of the wild ass, which God explains lives in the desert, away from the crowds and without a driver. The human being that commands a donkey. They don't have those. They live out in the desert, far from humans. How do they do that? Job can't explain that. Turning to the Reem, God asks Job whether he would use the Reem to pull a plow or conduct other agricultural tasks. And God points out the folly, but speed of the ostrich. Finally, God asks Job if he can terrify a horse or if he can command an eagle. Now, one of the mistakes that some King James advocates make, and I can't recall if Will Kennedy is one of these, I think he might be, but remember that any arguments that he's making, we're going to hold him to them. So if he says many Bibles in multiple languages read unicorns, the answer is many Bibles in multiple languages don't read unicorns, and those represent more complete scholarship on the subject. So why in the world does it matter that many Bibles in multiple languages say unicorns? It's not unicorns for sure. Now, what about rhinoceroses? Since we're dealing now with a real animal, but let's see how that works in this context. These are not absolute statements that God is making to Job. While Job didn't understand the calving of wild goats and deer, we have studied them more since that time. Does our studying them undermine God's point? Absolutely not. Do wild asses always avoid crowds and ignore animal trainers? That's not the point either. In fact, the modern day donkey is believed to be a domesticated version of the wild ass. And if you look at wild asses and you look at donkeys, you can kind of see the very close resemblance morphologically. They are, for all intents and purposes, the same kind of animal. Now, the Reem is the wild equivalent, as you can see from this context where God is going in his explanation to Job. The Reem is the wild equivalent of the kind of animal that in its domestic equivalent would do the things that God describes. So just as a wild ass isn't the kind of animal you see in the city being driven around by a driver and having to deal with crowds, the Reem is like the animal that's used for plowing and other agricultural purposes. The domestic animal that's in mind here, that's different from the Reem, but similar, is one that serves us, that abides in our barns. That's what crib here means. It's not a Ebonic slang or anything like that. Ebonic? It's not a slang term, crib. It means the place where the feed is. It's not used for plowing. Job 39:9 says, will the unicorn be willing to serve thee or abide by thy crib? That's the feeding trough. Can you bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow? Or will he harrow the valleys after you? But also, remember, not just the serving us abiding in our barns or crib and plowing, but also being trustworthy, capable of unattended or lightly attended work and bearing burdens, as laid out in verses 11 and 12. Will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? Will you believe him so that he will bring home your seed and gather it to your barns? Now, with oxen, if you train them well, you can load them up, send them back to the barn. Do you think that you can do that with a wild ox? You're going to trust him just because he's a big, strong beast that he's going to do what you want? Of course not. That's God's point. He's not saying it's absolutely impossible to tame a wild ox. He's just saying that it's not reasonable for Job to think that he can control wildlife.
Okay, so he's basically saying that these are wild things and talking about just taming them. Okay, so I'm going to get Job 33 up here. Job 33. Um, $34, $39. No wonder I'm struggling. This is the last example I'll look at. And then, okay, so he's talking about wild goats. Okay. Can you mark when the hinds do calve? Can you number the months they fulfill, or knowest thou the time they bring forth? They bow themselves. So the only thing there is wild goats, really. So these goats, they're in the wilderness. You know, can you say when they're going to have babies? Can you say, you know, it's going to be 3 months, 4 months, 9 months, or however long? Do you know what time they're going to bring forth? They bow themselves. They bring their young ones. They cast out their sorrows. The young ones are in good liking. They grow up with corn. They go forth and return not unto them. Who hath set the wild ass free? Who hath loosed the bands of the wild ass? Whose house I have made in the wilderness, and the barren land in his dwellings. He scorneth the multitude of the city, neither regardeth he the crying of the driver. The range of the mountains in his pasture is his pasture, and he searcheth after every green thing. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide in thy crib? So this would probably be where, because of this mentality that it's a wild ass and it's a wild goat, they're like, okay, this has to be a wild ox, because obviously you can tame this thing, you know. But obviously he's saying a wild ass. Okay, so this doesn't have wild before it. Obviously the word ass is quite common for a donkey. Goats are quite common, but these have wild. So 39, I'm just going to check Job 39:1. We'll see if the word wild is there, because clearly if it is in the Hebrew and it's not there with the Reem, why would that be? Obviously you're talking about an animal that is completely wild and is not going to be tamed. So let's look at the Hebrew. Wild mountain goats. Okay, so it's one word. Wild mountain goats. So it just means mountain goat. Okay, wild goats, wild goats. Okay. So it doesn't specifically have a separate word for that. So wild ass in verse 5. Let's look at that one. Okay, so it's just one word, the wild ass. Okay, so I'm just examining every side. So we are looking at that. So that was one thought that came to me. It has wild and wild. It doesn't have wild in front of unicorn. So will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide in thy crib? So let's look at everything that's said here, not just leave it out. Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow? Now, a wild ox you can. That's how you get a wild ox. That's how you get cattle. I mean, anyone who's looked at people with, bison, type of things in the United States, they understand that they were able to get these, to capture them and to kill them or to herd them. Or will he harrow the valleys after these? So they're obviously not going to be harrowing a paddock. Well, here it has, will they serve you? Will they abide in your crib? I mean, when you look in a lot of the Middle East, many people have cows living with the family. So you can go to a house, and one of the main bedrooms, you look in there and there's a cow, and you're like, okay, hello, Mr. Cow. And you can smell everything. It smells like a barn, everything like that. And then you go through the living room, and the cows are just right there because they're very valuable, and someone can steal them in the night. And so you keep them inside and you treat them very well like that. You wouldn't just leave them out in the paddock. Or will he harrow the valleys after you? Wilt thou trust him because his strength is great, or wilt thou leave thy labour to him? Wilt thou believe him that he will bring home thy seed and gather it into thy barn? And so I see what TurritinFan's saying here. He's saying you could read into that it's a wild ox, or you could read into it that it's a rhinoceros. But at the end of the day, with such flimsy evidence for a wild ox so far, being that it's related to arrows, or that it's a mistranslation. The King James made another blunder. When I go through this, I just see that this would make a great candidate for a rhinoceros. Now let me just change this word. Will the rhinoceros be willing to serve you or abide in your crib? Can you bind the rhinoceros with his band in a furrow, or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you trust him because his strength is great, or will you leave your labour to him? Will you believe him that he will bring home your seed and gather it into your barn? I think everyone knows that a rhinoceros simply won't do that. So there's really nothing there indicating that it's a cow or a bull. There's just nothing indicating that, except that that's just what TurritinFan wants to squeeze into there. Okay, so I'm pretty sure he's nearly finished here, but let's just make sure that we're on to the next one.
These are tasks that are associated with oxen. So wild ox or aurochs or a wild animal similar to them is the best fit here. A rhinoceros is not a great fit here, notwithstanding a rather bizarre and seemingly fake video from Georgia. I found it amusing, but it really does seem to be fake video from Georgia. If you go to the blog post and click the link, you can go check it out. I prefer if you don't do it now while you're watching, but at your leisure, you can go and see. It looks like somebody took a lot of time and effort, or at least some time and effort, to create a fake video that shows a rhinoceros being yoked up and being used to plow. It would crack me up if it's not fake. But considering that it appears to be taking place in Georgia, and considering the video quality and so forth, I believe that it is a fake video. But the point that I raise is it doesn't even seem to be reasonable to try yoking up a rhinoceros. It's not just that you couldn't do it because he's so wild and strong, like a wild ox, but the idea of substituting a rhinoceros for an ox is far-fetched. Because, for one thing, the rhinoceros's neck seems to be bigger than its head. And it does mean that Joe couldn't do it, but it would be an odd thing even to suggest. Whereas suggesting that someone might try that with a wild ox isn't so ridiculous. It's only ridiculous in the sense that Job is unable to tame the wild ox himself. Moving on to the next one. This is now the fourth point.
Okay, so really he's just saying that these parallels, so I understand what he's saying. He's saying, okay, the wild goat, okay. But okay, so let's just see if we domesticate all these, will this fit? Do you know when the domesticated goat will bring forth? Well, I guess if you've planned it and you put them with the other males and stuff, can you mark when the hinds do calve if they're domesticated? Yeah, I guess. Can you number the months they fulfill? Yes, I guess if you're farming them, or notice the time they bring forth. They bow themselves, they bring forth their young ones, they cast out their sorrows. The young ones are in good liking, they grow up with corn, they go forth and they return not unto them. Who hath sent out the wild ass free, or who hath loosed the bands of a wild ass? So let's just say domesticated. Okay, so who has sent out the domesticated donkey? And who has loosed the bands of the domesticated donkey? Whose house I have made in the wilderness, and the barren in the land of his dwellings. It's just, I mean, I'm just really clutching at straws, just trying to get into the mindset of TurritinFan here. Whose house I have made in the wilderness, and the barren in the land of his dwellings. He scorneth. So the domesticated wild ass won't scorn the multitude of the city, neither regards the crying of the driver. Anyway, I think that's just, I don't think you can read into that that's supposed to be a wild ox. I'm just not seeing that. But we're nearly at the 4-hour mark, and so I'm going to pull the pin on this, and I think we'll just pick up where we left off in our next video. So thanks for joining us, guys. God bless you, and we'll see you next time for part 3.